Imagine a whip-smart economist with a sprawling imagination. Now imagine he's 9 years old and wants to know everything. That's the basic profile of Stephen Levitt.
You know, he's a good writer. I mean, the thing about Steve is he's a good storyteller.
Selling drugs for a gang is perhaps the worst job in all of America. And that's what I'd like to convince you of today.
This is what I do. I don't have a job. I'm unemployable. I'm not good at following directions. That's why I became a writer.
You got all these n***s below you who want your job, you dig? If you start taking losses, they see you as weak and shit.
Learning economics, yeah, you know what this is. Learning economics, we're back up in this bit.
The Steve duo was short-sighted at best and completely dishonest at worst.
I've just never been that interested in economic systems.
Maybe weak and shit is an important hypothesis that needs to be remembered. Thank you very much.
You know, almost everything I've done, you could look at it and question whether it's economics or not.
In 2003, Stephen Levitt won the John Bates Clark Medal in Economics. This is a medal awarded to that American economist under the age of 40 who is adjudged to have made a significant contribution to economic thought and knowledge. Levitt received a glowing profile in the New York Times from journalist Stephen Dubner, who heralded Levitt as a genius, the new fun face of economics, eschewing boring talk of interest rates and stock markets to look instead at topics like street gangs and sumo wrestling. Levitt was known for being a good storyteller and asking interesting questions using economic tools. This storytelling ability proved itself when Levitt and Dubner went on to write the best-selling book Freakonomics in 2005. This was second only to Harry Potter in the charts and, just like Harry Potter, is now a household name. The authors became intellectual celebrities, building up a massive presence both on and offline. They subsequently released several successful books, maintain a widely read blog, and have a podcast which receives millions of views too. Agree or disagree with the duo, we all swim in their wake. In 2003, Stephen Levitt won the John Bates Clark Medal in Economics. It is probably the second most highly regarded award in economics after the Nobel Prize, and is typically a precursor to winning that prize later in your career. Yet 20 years later, Levitt announced his retirement from academia, having failed to win the Economics Nobel. In a 2024 interview, he acknowledged that his approach hadn't caught on the way he'd hoped. An actual Nobel Prize winner called Levitt's work cute and not real economics, while he himself admitted that he was a footnote to bigger shifts in the discipline. Of course, Levitt is most famous for his best-selling book, Freakonomics, a rogue economist explores the hidden side of everything. However, Freakonomics remains controversial, and many argue that it hasn't aged well, plagued by shoddy statistics, problematic themes, and factual inaccuracies. The sequel Super Freakonomics was even worse and angered numerous experts, most notably climate scientists, who called it error-riddled. Even The Economist magazine, a natural ally, concluded that Freakonomics had failed to transform economics. In 2003, Stephen Levitt won the John Bates Clark Medal in Economics. Levitt had previously struggled in his classes, being billed as one of the most likely to drop out during his PhD at MIT, but publishing top papers during his time there nonetheless. His mentors at the University of Chicago admitted that he didn't understand the intricacies of their economic approach, but they kept him around due to his appreciation of basic economic principles and his ability to approach things from a fresh perspective. Levitt remained something of a dark horse throughout his career. As well as success in academia, his novel and contrarian streak led him to popularity, giving TED Talks about drug gangs and publishing widely read books. His debut novel Freakonomics was co-authored with New York Times journalist Stephen Dubner. Neither of them expected Freakonomics to do so well, nor did Levitt expect to have much impact in his field. Throughout his career, Levitt, as well as Dubner, remained self-effacing, acknowledging his lack of technical skill and registering admiration even for those peers who were overwhelmingly hostile to him. So, in one narrative, Levitt and Dubner are international economic superstars whose impact was so large that Freakonomics has basically become the air we breathe. In another, he is an example of failed aspirations, a promising student who was ultimately a disappointment. In a final narrative, which seems to be the one favoured by the authors themselves, they're just awkward contrarians who made an unlikely duo that unexpectedly stumbled into success and controversy. How do we settle all of this? Well, maybe we should read what's in the book. I used to have a copy of this Freakonomics book, but I must have lent it out. I had to order a new one from Amazon quickly last night, so hopefully it's as I remember. I'm spending my college holiday break tutoring the guy I've had a crush on since freshman year. That is until the hottest football player at our university shows up instead. Freak needs to pass a class in order to graduate and heard I was the best. So we make the wildest holiday arrangement ever. If he helps me land the guy of my dreams by Christmas, I'll make sure he aces his final by the end of the semester. Every moment we spend plotting my target's seduction is hilarious, until I realise that I'm actually the one who's being seduced. Freakonomics is above all the story of incentives. Levitt and Dubner believe strongly that people respond to incentives, which is itself a central tenet of mainstream economics. To understand behaviour, you just have to understand the incentives, which they define as how people get what they want or need when other people want or need the same thing. They are big fans. Economists love incentives. They love to dream them up and enact them, study them and tinker with them. The typical economist believes the world has not yet invented a problem that he cannot fix if given a free hand to design the proper incentive scheme. His solution may not always be pretty. It may involve coercion or exorbitant penalties or the violation of civil liberties. But the original problem, rest assured, will be fixed. An incentive is a bullet, a lever, a key, an often tiny object with astonishing power to change a situation. Often when we think of incentives, we think of financial incentives like bonuses or penalties, which are awarded to people for certain behaviours or achievements. The illustrative first example they use in Freakonomics is an Israeli daycare centre. This place had a problem with parents coming late to pick up their children, so some economists suggested a straightforward solution. Fine the parents $3. By increasing the cost of being late, you change the incentives of the parents and reduce lateness. Surely, this was a simple application of the theory of incentives, right? Well, the scheme completely backfired. There was an increase in lateness, with the number of late pickups doubling. If I were writing a book about how incentives solve everything, I simply would not lead with an example where incentives fail to solve something. Also, I'm sorry, but the solution involves coercion or exorbitant penalties or the violation of civil liberties. If you create even worse problems when solving an existing problem, you haven't solved it. The operation was successful, but the patient died.
We did it, Patrick! We saved the city!
Okay. There's the snark out of the way. This isn't going to be like an episode of If Books Could Kill. Freakonomics. And we will return to the Israeli daycare centre. Much of Freakonomics consists of intriguing stories and studies. For instance, the first chapter about Japanese sumo wrestlers cheating was a fun read. Essentially, sumo wrestling in Japan is a bit of a closed shop with only a few hundred professional players. In tournaments, whether you get 8 wins a season is absolutely crucial, which leads to questions about this closed shop gaming the system. A wrestler's ranking is based on his performance in the elite tournaments that are held 6 times a year. Each wrestler has 15 bouts per tournament, 1 per day over 15 consecutive days. If he finishes the tournament with a winning record, 8 victories or better, his ranking will rise. If he has a losing record, his ranking falls. If it falls far enough, he is booted from the elite rank entirely. The 8th victory in any tournament is therefore critical, the difference between promotion and demotion. It is roughly 4 times as valuable in the rankings as the typical victory. Levitt and Dubner look at final matches where one wrestler has 8 wins and 6 losses, just above the cutoff for their ranking to rise, and another has 7 wins and 7 losses, just below the cutoff. They find that the 7-in-7 contender wins more than you'd expect, which could be consistent with the 8-in-6 contender throwing the match. But as they acknowledge, it could also just mean the 7-in-7 one tries harder because more is at stake for them. This alone doesn't prove cheating. More convincing is that when the same wrestlers meet again out of such high stakes, the 8-in-6 wrestler is much more likely to win. This is indicative of some kind of reciprocity. You helped me, now I help you. Even more interesting is that players are split into teams called bubbles. And when the 8-in-6 wrestler goes on to wrestle someone from the same bubble as the 7-in-7 wrestler for whom he previously threw the match, he is still more likely to win. So there's some group-level reciprocity going on here. As the final nail in the coffin, whenever allegations of cheating were in the press, these patterns disappeared and the odds of winning all of these matches were approximately 50-50. For me, this is the ideal Freakonomics case study. Using smart thinking to delve into an accessible example, which seems like it could be trivial, but is actually connected to some really important issues. They investigate a sport which had been treated as an unserious cultural curiosity by Westerners, and so capture people's attention. They go on to show that despite appearances, it says a lot not just about incentives and human behaviour, but organised crime. As they point out, those sumo wrestlers who had whistleblown about this died under mysterious circumstances. They're genuinely speaking truth to power here. The fact that there was a massive expose in 2011, perhaps helped by Freakonomics itself, is further evidence of this. The part about cheating sumo wrestlers is followed by a part about cheating teachers, the theme being cheating. There's some good script. They detect cheating among school teachers on multiple choice tests because teachers take a string of correct answers and insert the same one into a bunch of their students' answers. It's an astonishing coincidence that the same string appears on so many students' papers. The teacher appears to have picked a correct few answers in a row like A, B, C, D, A, B, D, C, D, B, C, B, then inserted it again and again into a few of the weaker students' answer sheets. Levitt used this pattern to catch and fire the cheating teachers. They frame this in a broader context of incentives to cheat, because funding has been made dependent on test scores. And just as I was thinking, oh, are you not going to talk about fraud and white-collar crime, hashtag serving the interests of capital, they did. They acknowledged that it's harder to measure, so tell the story of a bagel salesman who left his produce, along with a payment jar, in offices around the country at lunchtime. People could steal, and while most people didn't, a substantial minority did, and the number seemed to increase over time. It's a bit cute, but at least they're acknowledging the problem in a creative way. Every case study of Chapter 1 felt worthwhile, and the whole thing fits together under the theme of dishonesty, cheating, and stealing. Another bit of good Freakonomicsing is in the second chapter, the case of real estate agents. We know that houses are a more complicated purchase than, say, apples, partly because they have so many complex attributes that it's difficult to judge which house is better. It's also difficult to know everything about a house without living there. The funny lock on the bathroom door, noise from neighbours, weird smells, dodgy sockets, how good the bathroom is to cry in. You can't tell all that from a 15-minute visit. The Freakonomics authors acknowledge that these complexities can be taken advantage of by middlemen like estate agents. They use complex coded language like well-maintained when interacting with buyers. It sounds nice, but it's really a bare minimum, and if the house were truly great, they'd say so. Levitt and Dubner charge that estate agents want to sell houses quickly, so they will push the price below the seller's favoured one. So a big part of a real estate agent's job, it would seem, is to persuade the homeowner to sell for less than he would like, while at the same time letting potential buyers know that a house can be bought for less than its listing price. To be sure, there are more subtle means of doing so than coming right out and telling the buyer to bid low. The study of real estate agents cited above also includes data that reveals how agents convey information through the for sale ads they write. To illustrate this, they use data on how much real estate agents sell their own houses for. They reason that the commission enjoyed by an agent for selling someone else's house is only a fraction of the total, so although the agent benefits from a higher price, it is only to the tune of, say, 1% of that price. When they are selling their own home, they benefit to the tune of 100%. Sure enough, it seems that estate agents keep their own houses on the market an average of 10 extra days to wait for a better offer, and sell them for over 3% more than the average house. This reasoning is straightforwardly in line with the Freakonomics theme of incentives. Overall, there's plenty of good stuff in here. At its best, Freakonomics is a lesson in public communication. Their ability to tell you a story, to explain complex ideas, to pick fun examples, and to use memorable tricks to make you understand is unparalleled. In the estate agent case study, They take a list of 10 terms estate agents use and ask you to guess which ones are positively and which are negatively correlated with a house's price. When you inevitably get some of them wrong, it turns out fantastic and spacious are negatively correlated with price, you remember their point about the ambiguous language used by salespeople. But then there's the bad. To be frank, the book is littered with shoddy statistics. For instance, they wade into a debate about the influence of money on politics. They say that, contrary to popular perceptions, money has no influence. We won't go too much into this complex debate because I merely want to highlight this short excerpt on the amount spent on campaign financing. About $1 billion is spent per year, which sounds like a lot of money, unless you care to measure it against something seemingly less important than democratic elections. It is the same amount, for instance, that Americans spend every year on chewing gum. They're trying to make an accessible comparison, but it fails for an obvious reason. The $1 billion spent on politics is concentrated among the elite and has the potential to impact everyone's lives via corruption, whereas chewing gum is relatively equally distributed and doesn't much affect people's lives. I don't know why I have to explain this. Also, $1 billion a year on chewing gum actually seems like quite a lot to me. I don't know. These cat-candid comparisons are common, and it gets worse. In a section on guns and swimming pools, they claim the following. In a given year, there is one drowning of a child for every 11,000 residential pools in the United States. In a country with 6 million pools, this means that roughly 550 children under the age of 10 drown each year. Meanwhile, there is one child killed by a gun for every 1 million plus guns. In a country with an estimated 200 million guns, this means that roughly 175 children under 10 die each year from guns. The likelihood of death by pool, 1 in 11,000, versus death by gun, 1 in 1 million plus, isn't even close. One drowning child per 11,000 pools. One shot child per 1 million guns. Statistics. How do they work?
Fucking magnets. How do they work?
For a start, America has a lot of guns. Although most Americans do not own a gun, there are more guns than people in the USA. This means that those who own guns tend to own more than one, with around 1/10 of Americans owning over 5. That's most of the guns in the country, owned by 10% of the population. This matters because the risk of owning one gun is obviously much higher than the risk of owning 0, but the risk of owning 2 is not much higher than that of owning 1. And owning 10 likely isn't noticeably higher risk than owning 5.
Yeah, I'd kill you if I had my gun.
Yeah, well, you don't.
Levitt and Dubner are not looking at the risk of buying a gun versus buying a pool. They're looking at aggregate numbers, and since gun ownership is so concentrated in the USA, all those 2nd, 3rd, and 20th guns are masking the real risk of going from 0 guns to 1. A blogger at the Daily Cos reckoned that the relevant stat for owning guns was more like 1 dead child per 250,000 gun-owning households, 4 times higher than in Freakonomics. Secondly, the Freakonomics data on drowning are general, not just for swimming pools. Many drownings aren't in swimming pools, but in lakes or baths. Deaths by swimming pool is smaller by definition, and they just don't have the data on that. Thirdly, Freakonomics uses statistics for children dying, but not only children can be killed by guns or by swimming pools. I get that their focus is on parenting in this chapter, but wouldn't an honest appraisal of guns and pools simply include all deaths caused by them? Another blog I found showed that total deaths by firearm for all ages is much higher than total deaths by drowning. I'm not saying that this is definitely the correct comparison, but it shows you how different things can look with a simple tweak. I could charitably acknowledge that a call to be more careful when your children are around swimming pools, baths, and other bodies of water is completely fair. Maybe some parents are too relaxed about this. But any idea that parents should be comparatively more relaxed about guns is a terrible inference. The reason that deaths from guns are relatively low is precisely because parents know how deadly they are. As the Daily Cos put it,
presumably, if parents took Freakonomics to heart, and children were encouraged to play with guns rather than pools, the incidence of gun deaths would be quite a bit higher.
It's basically impossible to infer anything reliable about how we should treat guns and or swimming pools from one drowning child per 11,000 pools and one shot child per 1 million guns. Not only are some of the measures dodgy, it's a good example of making what's called an out-of-sample prediction. If you use X social reality to move towards Y, it may change the world and falsify your predictions. In this case, buying fewer swimming pools may not much affect total drowning stats, while buying more guns will likely affect total shootings. As a final example of dodgy stats, let's look at transportation risks. The sequel Super Freakonomics famously argues that drunk walking is more dangerous than drunk driving. 11,000 people die from drunk driving a year, whereas only 1,000 die from drunk warning. They convert things to a per-mile basis using statistics on walking in the USA. The average American walks about a half mile per day outside the home or workplace. There are some 237 million Americans 16 and older. All told, that's 43 billion miles walked each year by people of driving age. If we assume that 1 of every 140 of those miles are walked drunk, the same proportion of miles that are driven drunk, then 307 million miles are walked drunk each year. Doing the math, you find that on a per mile basis, a drunk walker is 8 times more likely to get killed than a drunk driver. It's easy to miss this, but why would you assume that the same proportion of miles that are driven drunk are walked drunk? People pointed this out at the time, including the journalist Ezra Klein, who said,
"As their initial example demonstrates, a lot of people walk drunk when they would otherwise drive drunk. That substitution alone suggests that a higher proportion of walking miles are drunk miles. Other people walk or take transit when they know they'll be drinking later. That's why they're walking and not driving. That skews the numbers and makes it impossible to simply assume parity."
If people walk drunk more often than they drive drunk, which does seem sensible given the formal and informal rules surrounding drunk driving, their calculation falls apart. The denominator of total drunk miles walked goes up, so the fraction of deaths per miles walked goes down. It's really that simple. Yet they just randomly make the assumption that the fractions of miles walked drunk and driven drunk are exactly the same. If I were known for the tagline, "Assume nothing, question everything," I would simply not begin my book by assuming everything and questioning nothing. What's even stranger is that they are inconsistent about using per-mile stats. In the original Freakonomics, if you are taking a trip and have the choice of driving or flying, you might wish to consider the per-hour death rate of driving versus flying. It is true that many more people die in the United States each year in motor vehicle accidents, roughly 40,000, than in airplane crashes, fewer than 1,000. But it's also true that most people spend a lot more time in cars than in airplanes. The per-hour death rate of driving versus flying, however, is about equal. The two contraptions are equally likely, or in truth, unlikely, to lead to deaths. But again, why convert to per hour in this case? Planes take less time to get to where they're going. You cover more miles. If you do a per mile calculation, flying is safer. It's not that either is always better, but it might help for them to acknowledge this point. They're just too committed to being contrarian by cherry-picking stats. If they can use per mile, they will. If they can use per hour, they will. And if they can make an arbitrary assumption that supports their argument, you bet they will. So far, we've seen a mixture of interesting, if sometimes cute, case studies, and some dodgy stats. But so much for the little stuff, I hear you scream. What about the big controversies?
Abort the plan! Abort the babies!
Sorry. Probably the most controversial chapter in the original Freakonomics book was the one about abortion and crime. Levitt and Dubner argue that the massive decline in crime in the USA in the 1990s was a result of the passage of Roe v. Wade in 1973, which protected the right to abortion. Their hypothesis is that by reducing unwanted children, abortion reduced the number of would-be criminals 20 years later. This is partially just because fewer 20-year-olds means less crime, since crimes are disproportionately committed by that age group. More controversially, the Freakonomics duo argue that the type of child most likely to be aborted is more likely to end up a criminal, since mothers who want abortions are more likely to have babies that grow up in dire circumstances, which in turn is a predictor of criminality later in life. Now, I know abortion is an emotive issue, and for good reason. If you've had negative experiences with this, then you might want to skip this section. We won't go into grisly details, but consider this a content warning. I'm also aware that you could infer something eugenics-y from their argument. Nevertheless, nothing about their argument bothers me politically, and in fact it coheres with progressive views as I understand them. One prominent pro-choice argument is that mothers who know they can't give the child a good life should be allowed to have abortions. Without abortion, poorer or less capable mothers, as judged by themselves, will have children who are condemned to a life of instability, poverty, and neglect. We know that these things are related to adult life outcomes, lower incomes, less education, and higher crime. So this can easily be framed as a progressive argument, and Levitt and Dubner do so themselves. When a woman does not want to have a child, she usually has good reason. She may be unmarried or in a bad marriage. She may consider herself too poor to raise a child. She may think that her life is too unstable or unhappy, or she may think that her drinking or drug use will damage the baby's health. She may believe that she is too young or hasn't yet received enough education. She may want a child badly, but in a few years, not now. For any of 100 reasons, she may feel that she cannot provide a home environment that is conducive to raising a healthy and productive child. Revisiting this, I honestly had no political bias either way. I tried to be ready to accept their argument despite the controversy, just by evaluating their statistical findings. And when I looked at both the chapter in Freakonomics and the 2001 paper by Levitt and Donahue on which it is based, I was initially quite compelled. They build up their case in a clear and transparent way which teaches you about the ins and outs of the statistics. This is probably why Levitt is such a good public communicator. His papers already read like explainers, something he himself recognizes.
The particular nature of the kind of studies that I've done academically tend to lend themselves to storytelling, and we, and so I think we wrote an entertaining, informational, educational book.
He's right. This first plot from the Levitt and Donahue paper simply shows 3 different types of crime in the USA over time: violent crime in circles, property crime in squares, and murder in triangles. The numbers are indexed at 100 in 1973, and they rose over the 1980s, but all began to decline as the 90s got going. These are FBI numbers, but self-reported victimization surveys show a similar pattern. So there is the fact to be explained, a decline in crime, which seems to be about 20 years after Roe v. Wade. Of course, this is nowhere near enough. So much is happening over this period that affects crime that it would be ridiculous to attribute the decline to their hypothesis based on this alone. As a concrete example, there was a crack epidemic over the 1980s which subsided over the 1990s, and that had little to do with abortion. Levitt and Donahue refined their findings by looking at states that legalized abortion a few years earlier than Roe v. Wade, between 1969 and 1970. This table shows how violent crime changed subsequently in these states versus the rest of the USA, which legalized later. The change is split up into periods, and the contention is that earlier periods, soon after abortion was legalized, should not show any difference between the 2 types of states. Between 1976 and 1982, a child born when abortion was legalized would have been too young to count in crime statistics, so there shouldn't have been a difference. As the table shows, there was a slightly smaller rise in crime among the early legalizers than the rest of the US. The rise in violent crime is 4.3% lower than in the states where abortion is still illegal. The standard error is in brackets at the bottom and is a measure of the uncertainty of this difference. When the standard error is larger than the change, then your results are too uncertain to say much, and since this standard error is 5.5, all we can say is that our results are super uncertain, or statistically insignificant in the jargon. What's interesting is that as we move from left to right along this table, a large disparity appears between the early and late legalizers. From 1982 to 1985, when potential kids would have been tweens, there is still no difference. However, from 1988 to 1994, when the kids would have been 18 to 25, a difference appears. There was an increase in violent crime of just 1.9% in the early legalizers, but an increase of 15.4% in the late ones. This difference of 13.4% is statistically significant, as the standard error of 4.4 is much smaller than the change. A gap is starting to open up. The early legalizers of abortion are seeing less crime than the late legalizers, at precisely the time we would expect, given the age of the children. This disparity persists in the next period, from 1994 to 1997, when the potential kids are in their mid to late 20s, prime criming age. You may notice that there is now a decline in both groups of states. Violent crime fell by 25.8% in the early legalizers and 11% in the late legalizers. The explanation is that at this point, Roe v. Wade could have been starting to impact the late legalizers. It was in 1973, so the aborted children would have been in their early 20s and committing crimes. There is still a gap as the early legalizers have had longer for abortion to take effect, but now the late legalizers are starting to catch up. This is also encouraging for their hypothesis, both effects arriving at the right time, given when abortion was legalized in the respective areas. In summary, this table shows a decline in the early abortion legalizers relative to the late legalizers over the whole period, an absolute decline in crime in the early legalizers starting before that of the late legalizers. Both declines line up with prime crime ages for would-be born children, from around 18 to 30 years of age. We've therefore moved beyond simple inferences from aggregate data to making comparisons across states depending on when abortion was legalized in those particular states. We're narrowing down our investigation. To cement this, Levitt and Donahue correlate the crime in a state with the effective abortion rate. The latter may seem complicated, but it's just based on the abortion rate when criminals were born. It's a backward-looking measure of what abortion rates used to be, which is kind of like a measure of how wanted a child was. The less likely they were to be aborted, the more likely they are to be unwanted. So the more likely they are to commit crimes, or so the argument goes. It's a bit of a depressing thought, but a useful metric nonetheless. This graph shows the change in effective abortions on the x-axis and the change in violent crime on the y-axis. You can see that there is a negative correlation. The larger the rise in abortions in a state where criminals were born at the time they were born, the larger the fall in the violent crime rate. As Levitt and Donahue themselves say, the evidence we've seen up until now is just suggestive. There is still so much stuff going on outside abortion laws. Approaches to policing, gun ownership, other laws passed like drinking or gambling laws. To account for all of this, we need to move beyond the point where we can really visualize things. This is when they start to account for differences across states and times at a really detailed level. Of course, you can measure things like the number of police or alcohol consumption directly. But different times, locations, and even people are just different in ways that are hard to pinpoint and measure. Sure, we'd like to gather data on everything relevant, but what about cultural attitudes, political changes, and economic trends? The way we account for these is that we use what are called fixed effects. These effectively control for the state itself, the year itself, the person themselves. They allow each unit of our analysis to be different in ways that don't have to be precisely defined. In this case, we can look at how things change in a given state at a given time when compared to other states at other times. For example, how did a change in the effective abortion rate impact crime in Oklahoma in 1995? We need to account for the fact that 1995 was different to other years by using a fixed effect for each year. We need to account for the fact that Oklahoma is different to other states by using a fixed effect for each state. Instead of treating all times and places as equivalent, which is what we've implicitly done up until now, we're allowing them to differ. Hello everybody. A patron informed me that Oklahoma, 1995, a bit of an unfortunate choice. I picked it completely at random, but that actually is the year of the Oklahoma City bombing. So it really was not intended to be any sort of comment on that. Oklahomans, I'm on your side. Oklahoma, where the wind comes sweeping. To do this, though, we need detailed data that follow the same states over time, which is no mean feat. Levitt and Donahue account for all of this and find that there is still a negative effect of abortion on crime. According to these results, an increase in the effective abortion rate of 100 per 1,000 live births will reduce violent crime by 14%, a pretty big effect. The left-hand side shows the coefficient of 0.137, which measures the actual effect of abortion on crime, and the standard error is 0.023, which means the coefficient is strongly statistically significant. On the right-hand side, they include all the measurable things we spoke about: gun laws, alcohol, policing characteristics. You can see that this doesn't change the effect much. It's now minus 0.129, with the standard error still small. Fixed effects for year and state are included in both estimates. Convincing, right? We've done the simple comparisons and built up their complexity. In the most recent table, we have super detailed data and are using fancy methods. We have all these measurable controls. We have a fixed effect for states and one for time. Well, here is a lesson in how hard statistical inference can be. We're still missing something. The name fixed effect is not coincidental. What we're implicitly assuming is that Oklahoma stays the same over time, and further that 1995 had the same effect across different states. Oklahoma is the same forever, while 1995 was the same everywhere. This is a pretty big assumption, right? We've already discussed the crack epidemic, yet surely that was a factor which both changed over time and changed differently in different places. Crime would have worsened massively in New York, for example, more so than Oklahoma, as a result of the crack epidemic. Levitt and Donahue are well aware of this problem, which is why in their final analysis they use fixed effects for each state-year combination. As in, Oklahoma in 1995 behaves differently to Oklahoma in 1994, but also differently to New York in 1995. Given 50 states from 1986 to 1995, this is 500 state-year combinations in total. So they are now looking at how, for a given state in a given year, a difference in abortion rates in the past affects crime rates now. If you're confused, think about it like this. At this stage, you're basically comparing the effective abortion rate of different criminals when they were born. As economists Foot and Gertz phrased it,
the best way to determine whether abortion has a causal effect on crime is to compare two people who are in a similar environment today, but who had differing probabilities of being wanted at birth.
If the persons who were less likely to be wanted at birth commit more crimes, that would seem to confirm their hypothesis. And Levitt and Donahue do, again, confirm their hypothesis. In sum, they build up their empirical work, starting with simple trends, moving on to state-by-state comparisons, correlating abortion and crime, then finally throwing the kitchen sink at it so that they're accounting for every possible difference between states and years. This is good. I mean, you could criticize the 2001 paper as spending too much time on the simple analysis when economists know that the money shot is the final analysis that we just spoke about. But I like it. It's transparent and well explained, and it works even better for the book. I reproduced it for this video precisely because I think it illustrates these issues with statistics so well. So what's the controversy? This is a broadly progressive finding with clear and well-developed statistical analysis. The end of the paper, which they quote in Freakonomics, tries to stay politically hands-off in an admirable way. While falling crime rates are no doubt a positive development, our drawing a link between falling crime and legalized abortion should not be misinterpreted as either an endorsement of abortion or a call for intervention by the state in the fertility decisions of women. Furthermore, equivalent reductions in crime could, in principle, be obtained through alternatives for abortion, such as more effective birth control or providing better environments for those children at greatest risk for future crime. Again, what's the controversy? Brace yourselves. They don't do that final bit. The state year fixed effects. They just don't do what they said they did. They made a coding error in their statistical analysis. If you haven't followed up until now, just think of this.
Homie, did you close the gate?
Yes. Oh, you mean tonight?
It gets worse. Recall that there are two links between abortion and crime. The The first is that fewer prime crime age people means fewer crimes, but this won't affect the rate of crime. So the second link is that those more prone to crime are more likely to be unwanted. Enabling mothers to abort would-be babies that would go on to have bad lives reduces the percentage of young people committing crimes. This is really what we're interested in because population decline obviously creates a decline in any behaviour that a population engages in. That's why the first link isn't as controversial. In their final analysis, Levitt and Donahue switch from the rate, which contests the second link, to the absolute amount of crime, which cannot distinguish between the two. So they only show that abortion had an effect on total crime. That is, before you account for the coding error, which is a separate thing. Their excuse is that there is measurement error in the population data, which makes it unreliable to adjust for population. While this isn't entirely wrong, you should still try it. Like, most referees at journals will make you try everything just to see how robust your results are. I'm surprised they got away with this obvious statistical tomfoolery. After all, they used population adjustments elsewhere in the paper. Foot and Gertz, who we met earlier, show that there is just no link between abortion and crime once you do what Levitt and Donahue acted like they were doing. Compared to contemporary debates over Roe v. Wade, this might sound a bit ivory tower, but this is a serious error, especially when the original paper was published in a top journal and then reproduced in a best-selling book. As it turns out, this is not Levitt's first rodeo. The original 2003 profile of him by Dubner contains the following story. Levitt had already published widely about crime and punishment. One paper he wrote as a graduate student is still regularly cited. His question was disarmingly simple. Do more police translate into less crime? The answer would seem obvious, yes, but had never been proved. Since the number of police officers tends to rise along with the number of crimes, the effectiveness of the police was tricky to measure. Levitt needed a mechanism that would unlink the crime rate from police hiring. He found it within politics. He noticed that mayors and governors running for re-election often hire more police officers. By measuring those police increases against crime rates, he was able to determine that additional officers do indeed bring down violent crime. That paper was later disputed. Another graduate student found a serious mathematical mistake in it, but Levitt's ingenuity was obvious. He began to be acknowledged as a master of the simple, clever solution. He was the guy who, in the slapstick scene, sees all the engineers futzing with a broken machine, and then realizes that no one has thought to plug it in. If I were writing a hagiographic profile of someone, I simply would not lead with a case where they made a serious error. Now, coding errors are not uncommon in quantitative research, and it might surprise you to learn that nobody really reviews your code, although that situation is improving. One exchange saw a 2006 paper on the returns to education entirely refuted because the original researcher was revealed to have made a coding error, which led to him grossly overestimating the benefits of education. There's a well-known and very good economist called Scott Cunningham who openly shares that one of the papers from his PhD thesis had to be abandoned because of a coding error, after being accepted into a journal, which must have been so disappointing. You know who else made a coding error in their PhD? Yours truly. I thought that one of my chapters was really neat and pushed to get it published straight away. I circulated it round the department where I had my first job, and the chair, who was Irish, read over it. Being a full professor isn't an accident, by the way, as he literally just looked at the paper for a bit and said, "Cathal, there's something wrong with your consumption data. It's almost as bad as your Irish accent." I looked into it and discovered a coding error which completely ruined the whole paper, rendering it unpublishable, if it ever was. Yet, as Dubner would hasten to point out, my ingenuity was obvious, and I would later go on to win the John Bates Clark Medal. Levitt defends his abortion crime hypothesis, but acknowledges that more than anything, this discovery damaged his reputation as a researcher. Levitt and Donahue replied to the criticisms by Foot and Gertz, but they just acknowledged that the paper ruined their results, then did a bunch of other stuff to make the effect reappear.
Now, prepare to marvel at the mysteries of the universe as I make this remainder disappear.
But 7 goes into 28 4 times.
This is a magic 7.
The details are too much to dwell on here, but the obvious question is, why didn't you just do this in the first place? Correcting the coding error and using the rate of crime simply falsifies their original paper. You can start doing other stuff to rescue the result, but this is like watching data mining and p-hacking in real time. Those things are our enemies. Levitt and Donahue released a follow-up paper on this only a few years ago. They update their analysis and test the predictions they made 20 years earlier. It's basically a rerun of their earlier paper, but with data up to 2014 instead of 1997. While this is admirable as a way of updating your analysis, it also creates a straitjacket. And the problem is that most of their findings are just not relevant. As I said, they are good for explaining the statistical issues, but the money shot is the full test, a la Foote and Gertz. The 2020 paper does carry out this analysis, albeit begrudgingly. I found it quite funny how often they passive-aggressively quote Foote and Gertz as saying this specification is crucial. Crucial. We've done the crucial test. Oh, it's crucial, is it? What I find really odd is that in their podcast and Economist article, Levitt seems to claim that the new paper confirms the original paper's findings, including this super important part of the analysis. But that can't be true, because they did that analysis wrong in the original. How can he compare? The main parts that are confirmed or strengthened are the weaker parts, the simple correlations and state-by-state comparisons, or results that use total crime instead of the rate. At the end of the day, those things only really have pedagogical value, in my opinion. They continue to claim that abortion is responsible for most of the decline, but from what I can see, they are basing this on the same analysis they acknowledge was flawed because it didn't include the crucial state year fixed effects. Levitt and Donahue's own results show that when using the appropriate measures and methods, the only statistically significant effect of abortion on crime is for violent crime. Note the stars showing a negative statistically significant effect. Property crime has no stars, while murders isn't reported. In addition, this effect is about half as big as the one we saw earlier from their original paper. It just feels like they're pulling the wool over your eyes, switching between different measures depending on which side of their mouth they're talking out of. There's something a little ethereal in this, but as a researcher, you do develop a sixth sense for when someone is doing this. This is why their abortion and crime hypothesis isn't widely accepted these days, and their follow-up paper was published in a journal that isn't as widely regarded as the one they published their original paper in. What do we think of the abortion crime hypothesis? It's easy to miss the forest for the trees in all of this back and forth, as a review by crime economist Ted Joyce acknowledged.
Making sense of the competing regressions can be difficult even for the most experienced economists. The policy implications of a causal relationship between abortion and crime are far-reaching and yet so controversial that anything less than a thorough vetting borders on social science negligence.
Joyce gives several sense checks for the abortion and crime hypothesis that approach it from different angles. 1. Crime did not fall among the young 20 years after Roe v. Wade, who are the main candidates for Levitt and Donahue's hypothesis. It fell among older people who were born pre-abortion rights and therefore are not less unwanted. 2. Nobody has ever found that abortion had a positive impact on other outcomes like health, education, and earnings, which would seem to be a natural corollary of fewer unwanted children. 3. It was generally not poorer or unmarried mothers who were getting more abortions post-Roe v. Wade, but middle-class ones, who could afford it and felt less stigma. 4. More abortion rights does not necessarily mean fewer unwanted children, as it can lead to more sex and more pregnancies because people are less careful. Abortion is only one input into whether or not a child is unwanted, and worse, its availability affects all the other inputs. A statistical nightmare, if there ever was one. 5. The fall in crime in the 1990s was international, and obviously, abortion rights change differently in different countries. Most reviews of international evidence do not find a link, and Levitt and Dubner cite questionable sources, not even proper studies, to prove otherwise. I'm not going to go into what did cause the drop in crime, except to say that there is no one cause. Abortion may be in there somewhere, but it's certainly not responsible for most of the drop in crime, as they continue to claim without justification. My view is that abortion was legalized in the USA in 1973, and around 20 years later, there was a substantial decline in crime. These two facts alone mean that many statistical methods will just pick up a relationship between the two. There's a lagged negative correlation. But the most advanced and appropriate techniques show the effect is small at best. Plus, the idea fails some basic sense checks like looking at who is getting abortions, who is committing crimes, and the effect on other outcomes. Plus, the original study suffered from some serious problems. Ted Joyce noted that the 2020 paper is just miles behind modern approaches.
You look for really sharp breaks, changes, because you can isolate what changed and if anything moves when this moves. When you have smooth changes going on, smooth changes in employment, crime, demographics, abortion is part of that smooth change as you move into the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, you can't identify abortion from the other things going on at that time.
Aside from all the stuff about abortion and crime, what I was beginning to glean from this episode was that these guys have a habit of making controversial claims and defending them to the death with subtle misrepresentations. But the book was about to go to more troubling places than just coding errors. The final chapters of the original Freakonomics investigate names and how they affect people's character and life chances. An opening case study of nominative determinism picks two brothers called Loser and Winner. It turns out that Loser did pretty well, he became a cop, while Winner did pretty badly, he became a robber. Another case study is a young lady named Temptress. Apparently her mum mistakenly named her Temptress after the actor Tempest Bledsoe, not knowing what Temptress meant. At age 15, Temptress was bringing men into the home while the mum was away at work. This anecdote is from an interview the authors did with one Judge Doggan, who quizzed the mum on her choice of name when this case went to court. Doggan reports that another couple called their child Amcha after the Albany Medical Center Hospital emergency room, the first thing they saw at the hospital where he was born. Great anecdotes, for sure, riveting. But now Freakonomics hits us with some home truths. As it happens, Loser and Winner, Temptress and Amcha were all black. Is this fact merely a curiosity, or does it have something larger to say about names and culture? When I first read this bit, I just put the book on my head like I wore it as a hat. I don't know why I had this reaction. I just did. It just felt relevant somehow. I didn't really know what else to do. It's a good hat. It's a bad book, but it's a good hat. This seems like the appropriate reaction. I was trying so hard to be charitable to these guys. Oh yeah, the name of the chapter is A Roshanda by Any Other Name Would Smell as Sweet. Oh boy. I describe the attitude towards African Americans in this chapter as gawking. The chapter generally expresses astonishment at what black people name their children. It does this at the expense of both critical thinking and basic humanity. One might ask, to pick an example at random, whether or not a 15-year-old girl who was selling her body was being exploited somehow. You know, instead of blaming her mum for choosing her name. Also, am I the only one who kind of likes the name Amcha? It's just fine. As an instructive video from Say It Loud pointed out,
because while it's cool to understand the other cultures and languages names come from, there's also beauty in making something up.
It's the ultimate expression of freedom.
It gets worse. I am, of course, referring to footnote 193, where, in my view, they let their guard down, presumably because fewer people will read it. In the main text, they recount a story told by the researcher Roland Fryer, where a black woman phoned into a radio show complaining that her niece had been named Shithead, although it was apparently pronounced Shitheed. In the footnote, Levitt and Dubner say, the woman who called the radio show to tell Roland Fryer about her niece Shithead might have been misinformed, of course, or even outright lying. Okay, so our anecdote is probably not true. Fine. But the note continues. Regardless, she was hardly alone in her feeling that black names sometimes go too far. Bill Cosby, during a speech in May 2004 at the NAACP's Brown v. Board of Education 50th Anniversary Gala, lambasted lower-income blacks for a variety of self-destructive behaviours, including the giving of ghetto names. Cosby was summarily excoriated by white and black critics alike. The evidence that people feel black names have gone too far is a speech which they don't even engage with or reproduce. They also note that it was heavily criticised at the time, but not how or why. Perhaps this is evidence that this Bill Cosby guy isn't a great spokesperson for the cause? They continue further. Soon after, the California Education Secretary, Richard Riordan, the wealthy, white, former mayor of Los Angeles, found himself under attack for a perceived racial slight. Riordan, visiting a Santa Barbara library to promote a reading program, met a 6-year-old girl named Isis. She told Riordan that her name meant Egyptian princess. Riordan, trying to make a joke, replied, "It means stupid, dirty girl." The resultant outrage led black activists to call for Riordan's resignation. Mervyn Dimmerly, a black assemblyman from Compton, explained that Isis was a little African-American girl. Would he have done that to a white girl? As it turned out, however, Isis was white. Some activists tried to keep the anti-Riordan protest alive, but Isis's mother, Trinity, encouraged everyone to relax. Her daughter, she explained, hadn't taken Riordan's joke seriously. "I got the impression," Trinity said, "that she didn't think he was very bright." Okay, so there's a lot going on here. First, fair play to Trinity and Isis for handling it in their own way. Yet again, though, the headline here is that an old and powerful mayor told a 6-year-old girl that she was a stupid, dirty girl. Do they not want to comment on that at all? Besides, this anecdote has nothing to do with anyone thinking black names have gone too far. That's not what it's about. They're just trying to paint people who make accusations of racism as ridiculous, based on a silly anecdote. And when I googled this, it seemed that the racial aspect to this story was not the main reason people were outraged, and Mervyn Dimmerly, the originator of said mistake, had admitted it was wrong and told everyone to move on. For some reason, they don't contextualize his comments the same way they try to do with the Mayor Riordan's far more offensive ones. Hey, if you're white and feeling left out, don't worry. Poor white people, always the collateral damage in American racism, don't escape scrutiny. Some of the other low education names are obviously misspellings, whether intentional or not, of more standard names. In most cases, the standard spellings of the names, Tabitha, Cheyenne, Tiffany, Brittany and Jasmine, also signify low education. But the various spellings of even one name can reveal a strong disparity. They then list the various ways of spelling Jasmine in order of maternal education. Wow, how dare people spare the same basic name in different ways. I'm sorry, but all names are made up. They're just collections of letters. Levitt and Dubner even acknowledge this when they note that Madison became a popular name after the film Splash, in which a character was named after Madison Avenue in New York. So who cares about amateur? In case you hadn't realised, this is an amateur appreciation channel.
Shaquille, as in O'Neal, is a creative respelling of an Arabic name. His mama probably just wanted to be a little bit different. You know, sometimes you want to stand out.
And who gets to decide how this is spelled in our alphabet anyway? Societies look down on some spellings but not others, when really it's just creative use of English.
Levitt and Dubner's understanding of race is literally paper thin. They bring up the famous resume studies which put black-sounding names on some resumes and white-sounding names on others, and found that black people got fewer callbacks. I went into detail on these in my last video, so I'll try to focus on the Freakonomics interpretation instead of repeating myself. According to such a study, if Deshaun Williams and Jake Williams sent identical resumes to the same employer, Jake Williams would be more likely to get a callback. The implication is that black-sounding names carry an economic penalty. Such studies are tantalizing but severely limited, for they cannot explain why Deshaun didn't get the call. Was he rejected because the employer is a racist and is convinced that Deshaun Williams is black? Or did he reject him because Deshaun sounds like someone from a low-income, low-education family? So Deshaun sounds like someone from a low-income, low-education background. So people with black names are more likely to come from poor backgrounds, even with everything else about them held constant. And someone from such a background is assumed to be unreliable and bad at their job. It's not racism, though. They continue by weirdly questioning the value of resumes. A resume is a fairly undependable set of clues. A recent study showed that more than 50% of them contain lies. So DeShawn may simply signal a disadvantaged background to an employer who believes that workers from such backgrounds are undependable. If resumes are full of lies, then why would that affect DeShawn more than Jake? Why? Parts of this chapter are just a documenting of names, how they differ by class, race, and across time. It's somewhat interesting, although it is amateur sociology, and by the 10th list of names, you start to get the feeling they're just filling space for the final chapters of their book. More important is that they mix up the issue of discrimination with the issue of names. This is most in evidence when they try to disprove that names are the important thing using a study Levitt did with Roland Fryer, the source of the shithead anecdote. They used statistical analysis to predict the effect of black names on life chances in a big dataset. They find that there is no impact after you control for a lot of background factors like location, education of parents, and so on. The supposed impact of having a black-sounding name is therefore accounted for by the environment of the individual, especially as they grew up. The data show that, on average, a person with a distinctively black name, whether it is a woman named Imani or a man named DeShawn, does have a worse life outcome than a woman named Molly or a man named Jake. But it isn't the fault of their names. If two black boys, Jake Williams and DeShawn Williams, are born in the same neighborhood and into the same familial and economic circumstances, they would likely have similar life outcomes. But the kind of parents who name their son Jake don't tend to live in the same neighborhoods or share economic circumstances with the kind of parents who name their son DeShawn. And that's why, on average, a boy named Jake will tend to earn more money and get more education than a boy named DeShawn. A DeShawn is more likely to have been handicapped by a low income, low education, single parent background. His name is an indicator, not a cause of his outcome. Just as a child with no books in his home isn't likely to test well in school, a boy named DeShawn isn't likely to do as well in life. Clearly, they're getting at something important, which is that the conditions that black people are disproportionately born into are really what matters. There are obvious problems with their analysis, though. Levitt and Fryer look at a large, imperfect dataset, an approach that is widely understood to be inferior to things like the CV studies, which are able to hold much more constant and control just for the effect of the name in close to an experimental setting. This is the same reason their work on abortion and crime feels outdated. Conducting all different kinds of studies is entirely valid, but don't act like you're disproving the CV studies, which is exactly how they frame it in Freakonomics. Levitt and Dubner do critique the CV studies on the grounds that the job applications were fictitious, but the employers didn't know that. Levitt and Fryer's study is also quite easy to critique on its own terms. By their own admission, they only have data on black women from California, which is a restricted sample to say the least. They don't have proper information on the outcomes they are interested in, so they have to infer it from where these women live. Finally, they don't have the kind of data that would be in a CV, like where people went to school or their employment history. Again, it's quite weird to act like your obviously inferior approach is solving the problem here. Methodological quibbles aside, the bottom line is that the two approaches are just different. The CV studies answer the question, at the moment an employer checks your CV, does being perceived as black reduce your chances? And the answer is almost always yes. Meta-analyses confirm this too. Levitt and Fryer seem to be asking the question, after controlling for some background, upbringing-related variables, do people with black names generally do worse than people without them? This is subtle, but these are different research questions, and the implications may not be so subtle. The biggest omission from the Levitt and Fryer study is at once completely obvious, but easy to miss when you're getting into the weeds of these studies. Most discrimination against black people is likely based on their looks, not their names. Instances where people only see your name are rare, and the CV studies were done because that's one small aspect of discrimination that's easy to control. In a big dataset, it's easy to see how names could be less important, especially if black people are just not applying for certain jobs in the first place, or education or loans. so they don't experience pure name-based discrimination. That's just one possibility. I don't know. We should acknowledge the broader conditions of African Americans, but also appreciate that names are just one way of getting at that. In the CV studies, a name was the indicator the person looking through CVs had in that case. In those studies that sent actors of different races in person and found the same thing, presumably the interviewer looked at the colour of the interviewee's skin. If names weren't available and they couldn't see them but they could hear them, maybe they'd have used accents. You can use hobbies, location, writing style to signal class. One way or another, people find a way to discriminate against certain groups. This research was never about what you name your children. In Freakonomics, they themselves unwittingly acknowledge that making it about names misses the point about discrimination. They note that picking a good name for your child isn't actually a path to riches, partly because names change so much. The reason some names are deemed desirable stems from rich and white people picking certain names, and those names becoming social indicators of importance, ability, connections. That's what's going on in this whole thing. The names of poor, black, or otherwise marginalised people are gawked at because of their marginality, including by you in this book. The name is an epiphenomenon. That's why the focus on names is ridiculous. They're getting the causality wrong. This whole thing is a bit like when teachers in the UK told students being bullied over their sexuality to act less gay. A wizard never acts less gay. He acts exactly the right amount of gay he is supposed to. God, I love Harry Potter. As a final effort at making this about names, they contend maybe Deshawn should just change his name. As someone on my Patreon pointed out when they saw the draft script and video of this, which you can get access to too if you sign up, please do so, as this channel is fully fan-funded without ads. The conflation of unusual names like Loser, Shithead, and Temptress with normal names like Deshawn, Jamal, and Amcha is pretty offensive. I mean, fine, don't name your kids Winner and Loser as an experiment, that's obviously horrible. But the duo are just ignorant and gullible about all of these urban myths.
Sadakoi Steel. Beautiful. See, African Americans have such a rich history of unusual names.
No, I worked at a company called Sadakoi Steel.
In a 2020 podcast, Stephen Levitt admitted that two of their purported black names, Orange Jello and Lemon Jello, were urban legends.
A leading sociologist who swore up and down to me that he personally had met Orangelo and Lemangelo, the two African-American children whose names were spelled Orange Jello and Lemon Jello. Like, I would never have put an urban myth knowingly into this thing, but like literally this guy has studied like the Black Power movement, and he was completely totally credible. I have spent a lot of time and effort. I've offered large prizes of financial rewards to anyone who can produce Lemangelo and Orangelo, and I am completely convinced that it's just an urban legend.
It's good to acknowledge when you're wrong, but why not reflect more deeply on your own biases and the limits of your knowledge? Their narrative in this chapter is just meandering and inconsistent. After discussing their own study which finds names don't matter, they conclude, and what if Deshawn had changed his name to Jake or Connor? Would his situation improve? Here's a guess. Anybody who bothers to change his name in the name of economic success is, like the high school freshman in Chicago who entered the school choice lottery, at least highly motivated. And motivation is probably a stronger indicator of success than, well, a name. I'll take a non sequitur to go, please.
Would you like fries with that?
Okay, so this is now a good left-wing breadtube video. We've determined that they're racist and everything. This generally gawking nature of Freakonomics extends beyond just race, though. The subtitle of Super Freakonomics mentions patriotic prostitutes, and Levitt continues to use prostitute as a kind of pejorative noun, even in his 2024 interview. Neither of us thought anybody would read a book if we did write it, but we both were kind of prostitutes in some sense. They actually seem to have a kind of obsession with sex workers. In the introduction to Super Freakonomics, they say, Levitt had to explain to his wife and 4 kids that he wouldn't be home the following Saturday morning, that instead he'd be having brunch with a prostitute. It was vital, he argued, to meet her in person to accurately measure the shape of her demand curve. Ugh. You guys are so fucking horny. Brother, you just get the sense that they can't empathize with people different to them. Everyone else is a curiosity, an NPC, a freak. Dubner's 2003 profile of Levitt noted that he watched a homeless guy as if through one-way glass. We have to do this in social science sometimes to be detached and talk about uncomfortable stuff in an uncomfortable way, like we did with abortion. But the one-way glass shouldn't become a barrier to understanding, let alone a personality trait. Basically, it's giving Gran Torino.
Hey.
In his 2024 interview, Levitt also recounts that he and a bunch of prominent economists regularly played golf together and chatted. The rich white guy sport, and funnily enough, he says that they could have been playing anything, but they weren't breakdancing, were they?
Reagan has officially retired from competitive breakdancing.
On that note, I want to draw your attention to the number of early reviewers of Freakonomics who praised it for being politically incorrect. Kurt Anderson.
Freakonomics is politically incorrect in the best, most essential way.
Time Out New York.
Neither politically correct nor pushing a political viewpoint.
The Jakarta Daily.
One of the smartest, politically incorrect, and definitely the most entertaining book you will ever read about economics.
Make no mistake, they sought this, they got it, they printed it. If you try to be politically incorrect, then you have to deal with the fact that your political incorrectness may just be ignorance, and that you're embarrassing boomers. And that will become even clearer 20 years later, especially when you approvingly quote Bill Cosby, which an alarming number of politically incorrect books from this era seem to do. But the problems with their perspective extend beyond the fact that they're two old middle-class white dudes who don't get it and likely never will. Beginning to understand this leads us to more of their biases.
If I scrape together the shortbread from Aberdeen 09 and this unread Super Freakonomics, which I pretend I thought she'd like, even though I'm pretty sure she'll hate it, then that's an acceptable bundle, isn't it?
Chapter 4 of Super Freakonomics is titled The Fix is In, and it's cheap and simple. This chapter tells us a lot about their worldview, and I mean a lot. They claim the law of unintended consequences is among the most potent laws in existence. Governments, for instance, often enact legislation meant to protect their most vulnerable charges, but that instead ends up hurting them. They then give 3 examples. First, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which aimed to reduce firings of disabled employees. Some research suggests it ended up backfiring and reduced hiring of people with disabilities in the first place because employers were too scared of employment tribunals. Second, the Endangered Species Act. This aimed to prevent developing on the land where the endangered species lived, but it led to landowners preemptively developing land before governments were able to intervene and prevent it. Third, fining people for throwing things away, charging them per bag of garbage. Instead of discouraging throwing things away, this led to a number of unintended consequences, including people stuffing bags more fully or even dumping them in the woods. It's funny how this last one was like the Israeli Daycare Center, an example of an incentive scheme backfiring. They even introduce it by saying, politicians sometimes try to think like economists and use price to encourage good behavior. But it didn't work. Again. And we're supposed to listen to economists. I'm getting ahead of myself. As far as I could see, every one of these examples was evidence-based and at least partially true based on the research they cited. Policies can backfire, of course. But what this distracts from is that they can also work very well. Not only can they achieve their intended aims, but unintended consequences can be positive. One example I always think of is the UK smoking ban. Passed in 2007, this prevented people from smoking inside bars, clubs, pubs, restaurants, and other spaces. Simple observation tells you that it clearly reduced second-hand smoke in these spaces. It was a success. Research confirms the health benefits. But one unexpected benefit was the creation of outdoor smoking areas, especially in clubs. Given how loud, crowded, dark, hot, and smoke-filled clubs could get, being able to step outside, whether you were smoking or not, was a boon, and smoking areas are now much beloved. As for the Americans with Disabilities Act, later research found that employment fell among those with disabilities because they saw the passage of the Act as a reason to get more education, a positive thing. The long-term beneficial effects could be substantial and entirely in line with the aims of the policy, albeit in an unexpected manner. So why not draw attention to the countless government efforts that simply worked? Education raised the skills, earnings, and quality of life of countless people. Public health interventions have done the same across the world. Even cash transfers to poor people, the most mind-numbingly obvious way to reduce poverty, seem to produce benefits without backfiring, for example, by making people stay at home and not work. The minimum wage doesn't seem to increase unemployment noticeably, but does raise wages for the lowest paid. The fact that many popular and human-oriented policies work is one of the main themes of this channel. It turns out that Levitt and Dubner do praise a lot of things in this chapter. It's just that few of them have to do with governments. They begin by recounting the story of Ignaz Semmelweis, the doctor who discovered that washing hands at hospitals could save untold amounts of lives. They move on to the amazing simplicity of vaccines, at least at the point of injection, and how many lives they've saved. They do something similar for seatbelts, which were enforced by the government, and then they have a slightly contrarian section about regulations for children's car seats that I frankly don't care about enough to look into. They then praise the agricultural revolution as enabling the world to feed a much larger population than a few hundred years ago, with a fraction of the workforce. They say it wouldn't be much of an overstatement to say that ammonium nitrate feeds the world. Another example they give is oil. In the past, if you wanted oil for lamps and lubricant, you needed to hunt whales. The result was, quite naturally, that the whale was headed for extinction. All until Edwin Drake discovered crude oil and revolutionized the industry, paving the way for a much more efficient, versatile, and readily available resource that also didn't kill precious whales. Earlier in the book, they emphasized how the automobile improved the environmental situation compared to horses, who left a lot of dung and emitted methane. Automobiles were an improvement along a number of dimensions, including safety, the environment, and the quality of urban spaces. Between the praise for fertilizers, oil, and automobiles, there's an obvious techno optimism to super freakonomics. And I'm not claiming they're simply wrong. Vaccines and hand washing are very good. I have a lot of respect for inventors, scientists, and entrepreneurs. Yet the fact that they clearly give a one-sided account of most of their case studies is illustrative of a bias. They both focus on cases where policies didn't work, and only report the research into those policies which reflects that idea. The statistician Andrew Gelman has called the idea that policies will backfire the bank shot theory of social science, which is when you bounce the coloured ball off the side of the pool table. Generally, the bank shot manages to make the coloured ball go further after hitting the side. The economist's way of thinking tries to claim the same for social policy. The policy will bounce back at you the same way the coloured ball does. It's not just about how the specific examples are reported, it's about the choice of examples and the narrative attached to them. And that narrative is this: technology, markets, and human ingenuity are the best solution to most problems, while government intervention will at best fail or at worst actively backfire, hurting the people it is supposed to protect. As they put it in one telling passage, the new oil industry also provided lots of jobs for unemployed whalers and, as a bonus, functioned as the original Endangered Species Act, saving the whale from near certain extinction. According to this argument, our real hopes lie outside of the government and various do-gooders. It's the entrepreneurial drive, scientific practice, and individual initiative that animated people from Edwin Drake to Ignaz Semmelweis to Jonas Salk, the inventor of the polio vaccine. While I'm happy with praising these people, I'm less convinced that the government is always their enemy. A lot of research and development, for instance, is funded by the government. When we literally reached the moon, NASA, a government organization, was responsible. The internet originated as a government program. Many universities receive tons of federal funding for research and teaching, including the University of Chicago. Maybe government funding isn't that great. Look, from imbibing their content, I'm sure the duo aren't ultra-free market libertarians, but it is their fallback. They never hesitate to make this point. In Think Like a Freak, they recall the time they met then UK Prime Minister David Cameron and took the opportunity to recommend charging people for healthcare, instead of having universal provision funded by the government and free at the point of use. Cameron apparently scurried off quickly, the only good decision he's ever made. They suggest that healthcare is like any other part of the economy, which is just absurd and basically ignores the entire field of health economics, which is about as close to unanimous as you can get on the fact that healthcare is unlike any other market. Specifically, there's plenty of evidence that charging people for healthcare makes them get less of it than they need. So it's unclear that introducing charges will result in people getting the right amount of healthcare. Instead, it makes many people refrain from getting healthcare that they really could use. Their choice of analogy is instructive in how shallow their thought is on actual economic policy. We suggested to Mr. Cameron that he consider a similar policy in a different arena. What if, for instance, every Briton were also entitled to a free, unlimited, lifetime supply of transportation? That is, what if everyone were allowed to go down to the car dealership whenever they wanted and pick out any new model free of charge and drive it home? Cars, the only path to free transportation. Obviously, many people have suggested free or at least heavily subsidized public transport, and Germany had a good experience with its flat €9 ticket everywhere during the pandemic. This loosely conservative perspective goes pretty deep. Even in one of their more compelling case studies, where they caught and fired cheating teachers, they failed to ask if changing the funding system or just increasing government funding might prevent cheating alongside other benefits, despite themselves noting the importance of grades for funding. Instead of calling for more funding or less means testing, they went with discipline and punishment. They are generally obsessed with crime. Like, really obsessed. That's a conservative preference.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in.
Levitt even used to take his liberal college students shooting so they could feel what it's like to hold a gun. As a Brit, let me tell you that I don't care how it feels and you're all fucking insane. If you follow my channel, you'll know I don't make a habit of calling people white, patriarchal, neoliberal, cisgender, heteronormative bastards. But if the shoe fits. Okay, so this is now a great BreadTube video. I've called them racist and determined that they're right-wing neoliberal shills. But you've no idea what's to come. In 2009, back when YouTube was just cat videos, blogs reigned on the serious internet. The economics blogosphere was big, along with other social science, statistics, and natural science blogs. A young undergraduate named Unlearning Economics would soon start his contribution before he later spiraled and became a YouTuber. People may remember this as the modest, constructive heyday of the internet, with highbrow exchanges between academics in long written form. Actually, these blogs were extremely catty and disputes between individuals stretched on for years, just like modern YouTube drama. Revisiting blogs is a bit of a time warp because there was a really widespread culture of argument by hyperlink. I've dealt with this here, that there, and everything else here, here, and here. You were expected to read a blogger's entire back catalogue before engaging with them, which had its benefits but could often be overwhelming and come across as lazy on the part of the blogger. On YouTube, we know better. You aren't even expected to watch the current video, let alone another one by the creator, before commenting. Why am I telling you all of this? Well, Chapter 5 of Super Freakonomics is about climate science, but I'm not a climate scientist. I'd love to be able to give you an in-depth review of the evidence on climate science the way I did with crime and abortion, but that would be overstepping my expertise. What I can do with my expertise as a YouTuber is to instead focus on the irresistible fight that ensued following the publication of Super Freakonomics, with climate bloggers and fellow economists absolutely tearing into Levitt and Dubner. We can look at this in the most he said, she said, Tumblr ass streamer drama using gotchas calling people dumb way possible, which I know that you'll love even if you pretend you'd prefer the climate science. Let's begin with the simple example of solar panels. Meet our first character in the drama, Nathan Myhrvold, the co-founder of Intellectual Ventures. In Super Freakonomics, Levitt and Dubner give Myhrvold a positively glowing profile. They note that Bill Gates once said, "I don't know anyone I would say is smarter than Nathan." Apparently, he is such a polymath that he embarrasses other polymaths. He has supposedly thought about climate change more than any climate doomsayer. and so on. Seeing his company name made me laugh on a rereading because I now know that intellectual ventures are best known for patent trolling, buying up patents without having invented or used the technology themselves, then suing the companies who do. Super Freakonomics notes the patent trolling accusation but says there is no evidence for it, without discussing the various times IV have won money from companies including Symantec and Motorola. IV seem to get a lot of money from not doing but suing. To be fair, Levitt and Dubner document that in the IV lab, they are themselves researching things like cures for AIDS and malaria, though whether they have actually cured these is open to interpretation. Anyway, one of Mervold's most controversial contributions in this chapter is to critique solar power as a solution to climate change.
A lot of the things that people say would be a good thing probably aren't.
Mervold says. As an example, he points to solar power.
The problem with solar cells is that they're black because they are designed to absorb light from the sun. But only about 12% gets turned into electricity, and the rest is radiated as heat, which contributes to global warming.
Okay, just one little thing. Solar panels are blue. You can Google it. They're visibly blue. It's quite something for the smartest man alive, who has apparently thought about climate change more than anyone, not to know this. Polymaths may well be embarrassed by Mervold, but not for the reasons Super Freakonomics implies. Am I just nitpicking? No. Blue was chosen because it's the most efficient. In other words, because, shockingly, the thousands of experts who have taken part in designing, building and rolling out solar panels have considered what Mervold said. They selected the colour that gets the most bang for your buck, energy-wise. Mervold's statements seem to anger the blogger Joe Rom, our second character. Now, Rom is a climate scientist and is obviously in the right, but he did seem to harbour an unhealthy vendetta. He released a 5-part series of blog posts, all calling Super Freakonomics error-riddled in the title, and cross-posted them on multiple websites. His posts are full of bold, italics, capital letters, addendums, and his blog just generally has that horrid 2010s formatting style that makes it look like the diary of a psychopath. One post seemed to claim, baselessly, that Bill Gates and Warren Buffett were at the heart of this Super Freakonomics conspiracy. Rom was certainly a man on a mission. Rom highlighted that Mervold thinking solar panels were black was not his only mistake. Firstly, solar panels were more efficient than Mervold's reported 12% at the time Super Freakonomics was written. Secondly, the re-radiation of heat that solar panels do is offset massively by the amount of emissions they will prevent. It's orders of magnitude different, so they do not, on net, contribute to global warming. Thirdly, usually solar panels are placed on something which also radiates heat, like sand or a roof, so you have to take the heat those things radiate away from the radiation of the panel. Rom quoted Joe McDonnell of Glass Point Solar, summarizing all of this.
The thermal energy balance for a solar panel runs vastly in the other direction. If our solar panel is pure black and 14% efficient, then for each kilowatt hour of electric power that comes out, there are 7 kilowatt hours of heat that were absorbed and radiated. But each kilowatt hour it generates, it eliminates the release of 1.4 pounds of CO2, which during its lifetime in the atmosphere will absorb 210,000 kilowatt hours of heat. So the energy balance for the solar panel, when it's connected to the US grid, is about negative 209,993 kilowatts heat per kilowatt electric, since some fossil power plant somewhere is being turned down based on its generation. And hey, if it's blue instead of black, that might increase to negative 209,995 kilowatt hours.
The best part of this was when Mervold responded on the Freakonomics blog like this.
Solar cells pretty much have to be black in the energetic side of the solar spectrum because they absorb sunlight. Of course, no material is a perfect absorber, so when I say black, what I mean is a very high absorption of light, 90% or more. Solar cells often have a bluish tint to them because they reflect a tiny bit more blue light than the other colors, but that's small enough that it doesn't matter for our purposes here.
He's literally arguing blue is black. Isn't there a saying about this? Or maybe that's two sayings run together. It's funny, when I say something is black, I mean that something is the colour black, but Mervold's galaxy brain definition clearly includes any colour with a darkish hue. Black! Joe Rom wasn't the only angry scientist who got involved. William Connolly said he stopped reading when he hit 10 serious errors. As he put it,
diagnosis in brief: 1, they write about stuff they clearly don't understand. 2, they pick a catchy reverse common wisdom nugget as a headliner without having the slightest interest in whether it's true or not. 3, they pick an expert to talk to, but since they don't have a clue about the subject, they don't know how to pick a good expert, or even understand what the expert says. And 4, there's a grain of sense in there, but so badly wrapped in trash, it is nearly unfindable.
Tim Lambert riffed on Connolly and found an additional 10 serious errors. Among them was when he contacted another person who worked at Intellectual Ventures and was quoted extensively in the book, Ken Caldeira. Caldeira clearly feels he was misrepresented as being too sanguine about climate change.
If you talk all day, and somebody picks a half dozen quotes without providing context because they want to make a provocative and controversial chapter, there's not much you can do.
The main example Caldeira gives is when Super Freakonomics claims that his
research tells him that carbon dioxide is not the right villain in this fight.
Here is what he said in response.
Carbon dioxide is the right villain, insofar as inanimate objects can be villains.
In longer form interviews, Caldeira also blamed himself for not proofreading Super Freakonomics properly. The bottom line, though, is that the book paints him as more relaxed about carbon emissions and climate change than he actually is. That's on Levitt and Dubner for not listening to him and representing him accurately. To give you an idea of how misleading their general discussion of climate change is, check out this passage. Then there's this little discussed fact about global warming. While the drumbeat of doom has grown louder over the past several years, the average global temperature during that time has in fact decreased. This is literally a Steven Crowder level talking point. Climate change happens over longer timescales than a few years, and there is definitive evidence of a long-term upward trend around which there is volatility, including short periods of relative cooling every so often, including the one they reference, which has since abated. The truth is that Levitt and Dubner are playing down global warming from the very start of the chapter. They begin by noting that in the 1970s, scientists were worried about global cooling, not global warming. A Newsweek article, citing a National Academy of Sciences report, warned that climate change would force economic and social adjustments on a worldwide scale. Worse yet, climatologists are pessimistic that political leaders will take any positive action to compensate for the climatic change or even to allay its effects. Who in his or her right mind wouldn't be scared of global warming? But that's not what these scientists were talking about. These articles, published in the mid-1970s, were predicting the effects of global cooling. The idea is that scientists have freaked out before, but about the exact opposite to global warming, which presumably gives us context for the narrative now. Otherwise, why would Levitt and Dubner put it in? To be clear, they never outright deny that the planet is warming now. Instead, they paint a picture of scientific uncertainty, for instance, describing the global warming narrative in condescending terms. At several points, they compare belief in climate change directly to religion, and approvingly quote the heretics. One such heretical claim is that human activity is only 2% of carbon per year, which is true but irrelevant. It confuses stocks and flows, since 1/3 of the carbon in the atmosphere at the time of the book was due to human activity. Nature has a way of recycling the carbon it emits, but we don't. Not wanting to feel left out, economists joined the scientists in the pylon. Paul Krugman called Levitt and Dubner out on their global cooling story.
No. What you had in the 70s was a few scientists advancing the cooling hypothesis, and a few popular media stories hyping their suggestions. To the extent there was ever a consensus, it was that there wasn't much evidence for anything, and more research was needed. What you have today is a massive research program involving thousands of scientists and many peer-reviewed publications, with all major international bodies agreeing that man-made global warming is real. You can, if you insist, dismiss it all as a gigantic hoax or whatever, but it's nothing like the isolated 70s speculation about cooling.
Krugman was pretty scathing about Levitt and Dubner, but not quite at the level of economist Brad DeLong, who was a bit like Krugman's blogosphere attack dog at the time. He urged them to abjectly apologize for the chapter. DeLong compiled a list of 30 suggested edits for the second edition of Super Freakonomics, a list he said was still incomplete. To give you an idea of the first few, the first edit simply echoes Krugman's point about global cooling.
Change to no longer put global cooling in the 1970s and global warming today in parallel. The scientists in the 1970s who were worried about global cooling had neither the quantitative evidence, the climate models, the understanding of forcing processes, or the peer-reviewed consensus that analysis of global warming has today. Placing the two in parallel is simply wrong.
The second concerns the tendency Levitt and Dubner had to conflate statements in newspapers by science journalists with statements by actual scientists.
Change to remove false claim that the quotes from Newsweek were the words of scientists.
I looked into this one, and it's actually worse than DeLong was making out. Specifically, Levitt and Dubner say some scientists proposed radical warming solutions such as melting the Arctic ice cap by covering it with black soot. Here is the actual quote from Newsweek 1975.
Climatologists are pessimistic that political leaders will take any positive action to compensate for the climatic change, or even to allay its effects. They concede that some of the more spectacular solutions proposed, such as melting the Arctic ice cap by covering it with black soot, or diverting Arctic rivers, might create problems far greater than those they solve.
So, the fact that melting the ice caps is kind of a wacky, last resort idea is front and centre, even though Levitt and Dubner quote it as if it's a serious suggestion. Not that Newsweek 1975 is a good article. As DeLong notes, it inaccurately reports a key climate study.
Change to remove false claim that Newsweek was accurately citing the 1975 NAS study, which says not that the globe is likely to cool, but instead that we don't know enough about climate to forecast trends, and that we need to do more research.
The author of that Newsweek article, Peter Gwynne, has since retracted it because it is used so often by climate deniers. He said it was sloppy reporting and he exaggerated for narrative purposes. What a model of intellectual integrity. Good thing Levitt and Dubner have a similar honest and modest approach to their good lord, what is happening in there? We'll get to that. Interestingly, mid-controversy, Amazon disabled searching Super Freakonomics so that people couldn't check this chapter without buying it. I'll leave interpreting that action as an exercise for the viewer, although I will say it's uncommon. The climate economist Yoram Borman said he was disappointed with Super Freakonomics. He pointed out that Levitt and Dubner don't really engage with IPCC reports, the most widely disseminated reports on the topic, and when they do, they cherry-pick bits to play down the extent and damage from warming. You know, using conservative estimates that, exclude ice flow, which I'm told is important. As Borman notes,
saying that temperatures over the last decade have decreased is misleading in the same way that it's misleading to say that the Middle East has gotten more peaceful since 1948.
The more things change. The economist Greg Mankiw, who is centre-right, underscored that Borman is worth listening to on this topic. Now, maybe these economists are better at understanding the economics of climate change. Well, not really. They quote Mervold as claiming that shifting away from coal power will be economically catastrophic with no evidence, even though lots of countries had done it before and since, including that exotic place known as France, which used very little coal even before their book was released. They go on to misinterpret the economist Martin Weitzman, who was known for his idea that climate catastrophe makes drastic action now necessary. In Super Freakonomics, they say, it is this spectre of catastrophe, no matter how remote, that has propelled global warming to the forefront of public policy. If we were certain that warming would impose large and defined costs, the economics of the problem would come down to a simple cost-benefit analysis. Do the future benefits from cutting emissions outweigh the costs of doing so? Or are we better off waiting to cut emissions later, or even, perhaps, polluting at will and just learning to live in a hotter world? The economist Martin Weitzman analysed the best available climate models and concluded that the future holds a 5% chance of a terrible case scenario, a rise of more than 10 degrees Celsius. There is, of course, great uncertainty even in this estimate of uncertainty, so how should we place a value on this relatively small chance of worldwide catastrophe? This is subtle, but Paul Krugman highlighted that even this is a misrepresentation, which was confirmed by asking Weitzman himself. Weitzman's work is all about how even a relatively small chance of catastrophe makes the case for drastic action now stronger.
Yikes. I read Weitzman's paper and have corresponded with him on the subject, and it's making exactly the opposite point of what they're implying it makes. Weitzman's argument is that uncertainty around the extent of global warming makes the case for drastic action stronger, not weaker.
A small chance of absolute catastrophe is not a reassuring thing. It's the opposite. This has been called the dismal theorem, and the fact that it is a call for drastic action is widely understood as Weitzman's contribution, even by his critics. Levitt has never produced research about climate economics, and it shows. I haven't either, but at least I've read it instead of just asking a bunch of patent trolls. Their inability to get the facts straight, their repeated framing of the issue as less settled than it is, and their outright misrepresentation of actual experts on the topic makes it a poor showing at best. Even when they may have a point, they end up making it clumsily. Like when they say that driving a Toyota Prius is useless if you use it to go and buy meat at the store. Yeah, animal products do have a big CO2 footprint, and that was underappreciated at the time, but why present a false choice? With the stage set, we now come to the ultimate point of Super Freakonomics on climate. In the previous chapter, their exploration of technological solutions to problems governments can't solve, they give us a taster of Mervold's approach to environmental problems by noting that he wants to eliminate hurricanes by putting little devices in the sea to make the water a bit cooler.
The trick is to modify the surface temperature of the water. Now, the interesting thing is that the surface layer of warm water is very thin, often less than 100 feet, and right beneath it is a bulk of very cold water. If you're skin diving in many of these areas, you can feel the huge difference.
As hurricanes are basically caused by the ocean warming up past a certain point, cooling it down would prevent that, no? Fortunately, we can do that using simple devices like truck tires.
But Nathan has a solution. It is basically
an inner tube with a skirt,
he says with a laugh.
That is a large floating ring, anywhere from 30 to 300 feet across, with a long, flexible cylinder affixed to the inside. The ring might be made from old truck tires filled with foamed concrete and lashed together with steel cable. The cylinder, extending perhaps 600 feet deep into the ocean, could be fashioned from polyethylene, aka the plastic used in shopping bags.
Biologist David Nolan has long been a critic of this approach to preventing hurricanes, most notably because it doesn't scale. Not too long ago, he investigated it properly using simulations.
In their computer simulations, they cooled areas of the ocean up to 260,000 kilometers squared in size, larger than the state of Oregon, and equating to 21,000 cubic kilometers of water by up to 2 degrees Celsius. Even with the largest area of cooling, the simulated hurricanes weakened by only 15%. The amount of energy extracted from the ocean to achieve this small reduction is equivalent to more than 100 times the amount consumed across the entire United States in 2019 alone.
And here is the cattiness.
You might think that the main finding of our article, that it's pointless to try to weaken hurricanes, should be obvious.
Scientists don't really take these things seriously, and when they do, they simply confirm that they are not workable solutions. That's why they're focused on more traditional solutions to environmental problems, reducing emissions, waste, rewilding, and so on. Not for Mervold, though. He not only has a geoengineering solution to hurricanes, but to climate change itself. He wants to pump sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere using a giant hose held up by helium balloons. Because of course, again, not a climate scientist, but in possession of basic critical thinking skills, I hope. More sulfur dioxide. Pumping sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. The gas that looks evil and kills people? That would sound bad even to a child. The main case study they use is Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines, where a huge eruption in 1991 caused average global temperatures to fall by about 1 degree Fahrenheit. This shows that sulfur dioxide works at cooling the planet. Of course, it also prompts obvious questions like, are there side effects to putting a highly potent and toxic substance into the atmosphere? Isn't an 18-mile hose that emits sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere a physical and political nightmare? Much more difficult to do than, say, building solar panels and implementing emissions reduction measures. And don't people generally dislike volcanic eruptions? Instead of answering these questions, the authors get horny again. What distinguishes a big-ass volcano isn't just how much stuff it ejaculates, but where the ejaculate goes. I thought I was reading this for a second. Climate journalist Elizabeth Colbert summarized the potential issues with deliberately filling the atmosphere with sulfur dioxide.
A world whose atmosphere is loaded with carbon dioxide on the one hand and sulfur dioxide on the other would be a fundamentally different place from the Earth as we know it. Among the many likely consequences of shooting SO2 above the clouds would be new regional weather patterns. After major volcanic eruptions, Asia and Africa have a nasty tendency to experience drought, ozone depletion, and increased acid rain. Meanwhile, as long as the concentration of atmospheric CO2 continued to rise, more and more sulfur dioxide would have to be pumped into the air to counteract it. The amount of direct sunlight reaching the Earth would fall, even as the oceans became increasingly acidic. There are eminent scientists, among them the Nobel Prize-winning chemist Paul Crutzen, who argue that geoengineering should be seriously studied, but only with the understanding that it represents a risky, last-ditch attempt to avert catastrophe.
The best case scenario is that the cooling happens, but leaves us in a kind of Blade Runner-esque world which is dark, polluted, and lacking in what we currently consider the environment. The worst case is that it sets off a series of unpredictable chain reactions that end life as we know it, even more quickly and severely than just letting climate change run would. Ken Caldeira, who they'd already misrepresented, agrees that geoengineering is at best a last-ditch attempt which would lead to a dystopian science fiction world. He says that the best way to avert climate change is zero emissions. You may be wondering, what happened to unintended consequences? The environment, like the economy, is a complex system, so the law of unintended consequences should also apply, right? Well, Mervold insists that it's fine in this case.
Of course it's playing with Mother Nature. You say that like it's a bad thing.
So they appear to have left their thinking like an economist hats at the door of intellectual ventures. They even have this weird thing about how a carbon tax won't work, which, what happened to people respond to incentives, guys? Increase the costs of emitting with a tax and get fewer emissions? This is like the third example where they no longer believe in incentives, after the Israeli daycare center and the fine for garbage bags. I know I've critiqued carbon taxes on this channel before, but please, do you really think that's the same angle they're coming from? Bankers. Brad DeLong summarized the drama thusly.
It really does look to me like Levitt and Dubner went to Mervold's intellectual ventures, got wowed, excitedly wrote up what they heard, and then failed to do their intellectual due diligence about what they were told there.
These guys are clearly super gullible, at least when you fit certain criteria. For instance, one of the climate heretics they cite approvingly is none other than Boris Johnson. You know, the guy who fabricated stories when he was a Telegraph journalist, then was booted out of the Prime Minister's office for breaking the law and messing up our management of COVID, who boasted that he was shaking hands with people as late as February 2020 without washing them. Remember hand washing and vaccines and how good they are, Stevens? Think you might have fallen in with the wrong crowd at all? It's funny, because I consider myself a techno-optimist of sorts. Solar power is literally the most incredible and exciting technological development of the present day. It's not just that they are techno-optimists, it's that they insist a solution must be simple and cheap and come from outside the government. Their issue is that solar power obviously requires some investment and gumption. It's not that one weird trick that everyone else is missing. Levitt continues to do this in other contexts. In a 2020 interview, he was talking about GPS tracking of criminals as an alternative to prison. Their insistence that there is a cheap technological solution to everything reminds me of H.L. Mencken's famous quote.
There's always a well-known solution to every human problem. Neat, plausible, and wrong.
Much shade was thrown. But nobody did it quite like Raymond Pierre Humbert, a geophysics professor at Levitt's own University of Chicago, who wrote him an open letter.
The point here is that really simple arithmetic, which you could not be bothered to do, would have been enough to tell you that the claim that the blackness of solar cells makes solar energy pointless is complete and utter nonsense. I don't think you would have accepted such laziness and sloppiness in a term paper from one of your students, so why do you accept it from yourself? What does the failure to do such basic thinking with numbers say about the extent to which anything you write can be trusted? How do you think it reflects on the profession of economics when a member of that profession, somebody who that profession seems to esteem highly, publicly and noisily shows that he cannot be bothered to do simple arithmetic and elementary background reading, not even for a subject of such paramount importance as global warming? And it's not as if the black solar cell gaffe was the only bit of academic malpractice in your book. Among other things, the presentation of aerosol geoengineering as a harmless and cheap quick fix for global warming ignored a great deal of accessible and readily available material on the severe risks involved, as Gavin noted in his recent post. The fault here is not that you dared to advocate geoengineering as a solution. There is a broad spectrum of opinion among scientists about the amount of aerosol geoengineering research that is justified, but very few scientists think of it as anything but a desperate last-ditch attempt, or, at best, a strategy to be used in extreme moderation as part of a basket of strategies dominated by emissions reductions. You owe it to your readers to present a fair picture of the consequences of geoengineering, but chose not to do so.
Full professors, guys. Raymond Pierre Humbert also happens to be the best name ever. If you chose this name for your child, they definitely do well in life. Naturally, the Freakonomics authors had to respond. Like most of their output, their response is a masterclass in rhetoric. They have given the impression that we are global warming deniers of the worst sort, and that our analysis of the issue is ideological and unscientific. It's funny because none of the major actors I have quoted accuse them of climate denial. I'm sure a few bloggers and commenters took things too far, but the main problem is that they are completely wrong about almost everything they say. Joe Romm challenged them to identify actual smears like factually incorrect claims because everything substantive said about the chapter was correct. Instead, there is a lot of padding in their response, such as who intellectual ventures are, what externalities are, how they look forward to having actual conversations, etc. They're mostly focused on the issue of interpretation because that's obviously the most fluffy, and they write in such a way that they can have plausible deniability. For example, they say of Krugman, if someone interprets our brief mention of the global cooling scare of the 1970s as an assertion of a scientific consensus that the planet was cooling, that feels like a willful misreading. Here is how the chapter introduces global cooling. The headlines have been harrowing, to say the least. Some experts believe that mankind is on the threshold of a new pattern of adverse global climate for which it is ill-prepared, one New York Times article declared. It quoted climate researchers who argued that this climatic change poses a threat to the people of the world. A Newsweek article, citing a National Academy of Science report, warned that climate change would force economic and social adjustments on a worldwide scale. Worse yet, climatologists are pessimistic that political leaders will take any positive action to compensate for the climatic change or even to allay its effects. Man, how could anyone think you were speaking about a scientific consensus or framing this as significant? This is the first thing in the chapter, and global cooling even appears in the subtitle of Super Freakonomics. They then claim that Ken Caldeira was not misrepresented in any major way, and that they say that he was more pessimistic than Mervold and others at Intellectual Ventures. Now, in the book, they do indeed say Caldeira is thoroughly convinced that human activity is responsible for some global warming and is more pessimistic than Mervold about how future climate will affect humankind. He believes we are being incredibly foolish emitting carbon dioxide as we currently do. However, they quote this part in the blog post while leaving out the part immediately after, in which they play down the role of CO2. Yet his research tells him that carbon dioxide is not the right villain in this fight. For starters, as greenhouse gases go, it's not particularly efficient. A doubling of carbon dioxide traps less than 2% of the outgoing radiation emitted by the Earth, he says. Furthermore, atmospheric carbon dioxide is governed by the law of diminishing returns. Each gigaton added to the air has less radiative impact than the previous one. So the not the right villain quote is where everyone agrees they misrepresented Caldeira. While the duo themselves admit this one, they don't note the positioning of the quote. It completely undoes the previous notion that Caldeira is more pessimistic by saying he doesn't think CO2 is the right villain immediately afterwards. He does, and they cannot use the previous part to compensate for this when that is the very part the misquote undermines. Caldeira is unfailingly polite and clearly did not want to get the duo into any more trouble, so he simply stated that this was the only major misrepresentation and that the rest was about differences in interpretation, which Levitt and Dubner had a right to as authors. You get the impression he just isn't used to the public attention. He said he learned a hard lesson about public relations from this whole thing. Yet even in the Freakonomics blog post defending themselves, they quote Caldera as saying,
I do think there are a bunch of things in this chapter that give misimpressions.
Caldera's kindness and the Freakonomics spin really bury the lead here. Ultimately, Caldera believes in strong action to reduce emissions using traditional policies, and that's just not the impression you're left with in the chapter. There is more in their response, but I won't go through all of it, except to say that they fail to respond to Connolly's 10 errors, Lambert's 10 more errors, or DeLong's 30 errors. Mistakes about solar panels, about the flow of CO2 versus the stock, about the Toyota Prius and meat, about Martin Weitzman, about the IPCC reports. And after all of this, they have the temerity to say, now that global warming has transcended science to become a political issue, the rules of politics apply. If you don't like someone's position, attack their credibility. They then literally attack Joe Romm's credibility by claiming he put words in Caldera's mouth with the quote about him being misrepresented. They published the whole email exchange between the two, and to be fair, it is a bit of Romm asking Caldera, can you say this for me? Which, yeah, but if you know anything about how people get quotes, you'll know it's not usually as clean as it's represented in the final print. Caldera also said yes when he was free to say no. Levitt and Dubner additionally document that Romm is progressive, so it's apparently unsurprising he'd disagree with them. Why? They're playing the man as much as anyone here. Paul Krugman said much the same.
Legalistic quibbling about who said what in an email isn't going to help Dubner and Levitt here. In this crucial chapter, there's an average of one statement per page that's either flatly untrue or deeply misleading.
I'd actually say this whole thing is an early example of how modern-day gurus respond to criticism. 1. Insist that they just want a calm, rational debate on the merits. 2. Slow everything down by explaining basic stuff everybody in the debate already knows. 3. Avoid the main claims against them. 4. Respond only to the most extreme possible counter-arguments, whether they've been made or not. 5. Claim they're being attacked, smeared, and discredited. 6. Attack and smear those criticizing them. Through their use of language, chosen examples, and misrepresentations, Levitt and Dubner constructed a specific argument, and that argument was that there was substantial uncertainty over modern climate science, that traditional solutions were less reliable than thought, and that geoengineering was more promising than thought. If that's not the message of the chapter, it's just a series of undisciplined and counterfactual ramblings about climate science. Paul Krugman charged that they'd just taken the contrarian thing too far.
At first glance, though, what it looks like is that Levitt and Dubner have fallen into the trap of counterintuitiveness. For a long time, there's been an accepted way for commentators on politics, and to some extent economics, to distinguish themselves by shocking the bourgeois in ways that, of course, aren't really dangerous. And Coulter's making sense. Bush is good for the environment. You get the idea. Clever snark like this can get you a long way in career terms, but the trick is knowing when to stop. It's one thing to do this on relatively inconsequential media or cultural issues, but if you're going to get into issues that are both important and the subject of serious study, like the fate of the planet, you'd better be very careful not to stray over the line between being counterintuitive and being just plain unforgivably wrong.
Recall that many of the blurbs for the original Freakonomics praised it for being politically incorrect. Recall their obvious Chicago school leanings. Recall them calling Joe Romm a progressive. They knew what they were doing, pissing off the libs. Then they didn't like what they got. Blogger Dan Davies had what I'd regard as the final word when he intervened to tell the duo to stop fucking crying because they had actively sought this controversy.
The whole idea of contrarianism is that you're attacking the conventional wisdom. You're telling people that their most cherished beliefs are wrong. You're turning the world upside down. In other words, you're setting out to annoy people. Now, opinions may differ on whether this is a laudable thing to do. I think it's fantastic. But if annoying people is what you're trying to do, then you can hardly complain when annoying people is what you actually do. Like, if you start a fight, you can hardly be surprised that you're in a fight. It's the definition of passive aggression and really quite unseemly. To set out to provoke people and then when they react passionately and defensively, to criticize them for not holding to your standards of a calm and rational debate. If Super Freakonomics wanted a calm and rational debate, this chapter would have been called something like Geoengineering, Issues in Relative Cost Estimation of SO2 Shielding, and the book would have sold about 5 copies.
This drama is just amazing, honestly. YouTubers have nothing on this. This is art. You guys think it's clever just to call people dumb fucks. Be better. Be like Dan Davies. And Raymond Pierre Humbert. Sadly, the duo haven't internalized this lesson, nor the natural conclusion that their chapter was just bad. In a 2015 Guardian article, Levitt said, "I think we pointed out that it's completely, totally, and actually much more religion than science. I mean, what are you going to do about that? I think that's just a fact." We've seen that they have numerous social and political biases. But being a privileged white dude or a conservative doesn't explain why you double down like this, when you're so frightfully, demonstrably wrong about something completely outside of your expertise and you failed to do due diligence to compensate. This really gets us to the heart of their worldview. Hello, and welcome to another edition of Economists Say the Funniest Things. This is where we look back through the history of economists discussing anything and everything using the economic way of thinking, with conclusions that will shock you. Okay, I can't do this for too long. This isn't one of those channels. We've seen this in action plenty in this video, with abortion and crime, with climate, and with race. But the tradition of economics imperialism dates back much further than that. Economics imperialism, by the way, should be distinguished from economic imperialism of the invade a country and take their stuff variety. We're talking about something more academic. As Super Freakonomics highlights, an economist called Gary Becker paved the way for economics imperialism. Becker started his career studying topics that weren't typically germane to economics: crime and punishment, drug addiction, the allocation of time, and the costs and benefits of marriage, child rearing, and divorce. Most of Becker's work had to do with creating mathematical models of things where people behaved rationally, given certain personal preferences and external constraints like budget. For instance, Becker modelled crime as rational. Criminals would simply calculate the probability of being caught and the cost of punishment, and if the expected benefit of the crime were higher than the expected cost, they would do it. This simple calculus seemed to cut through all the complex talk of motivations and upbringing and society.
You're a drunken, childish buffoon.
Which is society's fault because...
Becker didn't stop there. Addicts were rational because they planned the entire future value of the benefit they'd gain from addiction versus the costs. Marriage was rational because women only got married if the consumption bundle they enjoyed married was higher than the one they enjoyed single. Naturally, many people objected to Becker's theories, which usually entailed fancy mathematics to make narrow predictions about behaviour. This meant reducing complex social and economic problems to only a few variables. Economist Barbara Bergman called Becker's theory of the family preposterous for numerous reasons. It ignores work done by women in the household and therefore paints men as altruistic for sharing resources with them. It also implies that multiple wives are not only good for women, but bad for men. This is because, within this model, polyamory is a bit like having more men in the dating market, so naive economic analysis would suggest that as men become less scarce, this benefits women. Historically, of course, polyamory has been associated with more control and resources for men, though Bergman was writing before ethical non-monogamy took off.
I don't even really think that I'm that worried about what is or isn't going on down here. You know, it's okay.
Good night. I can see how tired you are.
Once more, this is firmly in line with the University of Chicago tradition, which relates to their pro-market and anti-government worldview. Bergman charges,
Becker's method of thinking about the family leads, as does almost all neoclassical theory, to conclusions that the institutions depicted are benign, and that the government intervention would be useless at best or, more likely, harmful.
I'm not here to give a full appraisal of Becker's work. As with the abortion crime link, I'll go with, yes, some of the rational Beckerian calculus is probably in there, but there are a plethora of equally relevant considerations that don't fit the theory. Empty compulsion, like when you pick up your phone for no reason, makes no sense if addiction is planned to give you utility over your lifetime. Regardless of these obviously unrealistic contours of the theory, The economist Chris Auld actually gave a pretty good defense of it on the podcast Rationally Speaking back in 2018.
The model predicts that if I increase the future price of the addictive good, addicts will respond by immediately reducing their consumption of that good.
You mean like announcing that next year we're going to add a tax on alcohol?
So the model says if the government says on January 1st we're going to greatly increase the tax on tobacco, people will respond by immediately smoking less. They might go and hoard cigarettes, but they're going to smoke less of them, the model says. And I think most people, so I teach this every year in health economics classes, and I ask people before I give the reveal, what do you think the model says? And most people actually predict the opposite. They say something like, oh, well, if alcohol is going to become more expensive tomorrow, what I should do is, well, get blind drunk today while I still have the chance. The model says, no, you should do the other thing. So later, about 6 or 7 years after the theory was published, people showed it was true. Let me actually use a different example. About 5 years after that, people showed in very careful analysis that future tax changes on tobacco immediately affect behavior only if they're announced, which is exactly what we would expect. So if the government surprises people by increasing the tax, well, nobody responds to that prior. But if they say 6 months from now, we're going to increase the tax on tobacco, they immediately reduce their consumption.
What's important for us is what Becker's work signaled for later instances of economics imperialism like Freakonomics. Levitt and Dubner themselves drew parallels between the two. Truth be told, what Becker was doing was actually Freakonomics, marrying the economic approach to a rogue, freakish curiosity, but the word hadn't yet been invented. The idea was that the tools used in economics were universally applicable. Generally speaking, economists modelled people making choices, so, in principle, any choice could be modelled, whether it was buying sweets or buying a spouse. Economists during the 50s and 60s frequently made proclamations that economics was the universal language of social science and would pave the way for a unified theory. Becker's longtime collaborator Richard Posner articulated this idea aggressively.
There is an open-ended set of concepts, most of which are derived from a common set of assumptions about individual behavior and can be used to make predictions about social behavior. And that when used in sufficient density, these concepts make a work of scholarship economic, regardless of its subject matter or its author's degree. When economics is defined in this way, there is nothing that makes the study of marriage and divorce less suitable a priori for economics than the study of the automobile industry or the inflation rate.
Economics imperialism was both successful and unsuccessful. Becker won the Nobel Prize. This research lives on in contemporary journals and in best-selling books like Freakonomics. But it is now widely acknowledged that it misses important things about reality and therefore cannot be considered a true theory of everything. For the purposes of this video, my problem with economics imperialism is not that there are some economists who study topics you wouldn't expect, like crime or abortion. Someone like Ted Joyce is an expert on crime and abortion, and he is an economist. Joran Borman is an expert on the environment, and he is an economist. Many behavioral economists like myself have studied or taught psychology. Interdisciplinarity is good. What's not so good is the tendency for economists to think that they have things to say about everything. Even then, it's not that economists weigh in as one among a whole bunch of experts or as part of a democratic process. It's that they wade in and strongly believe that after thinking about it for a couple of minutes, they've suddenly solved a problem that has plagued other experts and societies for a long time. Even then, it's not just that they think they've solved the problem, it's that they insist that everyone else is somehow stupid or ignorant or politically motivated or, worst of all, emotional. Other people aren't thinking like an economist, which Levitt and Dubner define in the following way. The economic approach isn't meant to describe the world as any one of us might want it to be, or fear that it is, or pray that it becomes, but rather to explain what it actually is. Most of us want to fix or change the world in some fashion, but to change the world, you first have to understand it. I mean, you could start by understanding climate science. Elizabeth Kolber called out their attitude during that very debacle.
Neither Levitt, an economist, nor Dubner, a journalist, has any training in climate science, or, for that matter, in science of any kind. It's their contention that they don't need it. The whole conceit behind Super Freakonomics, and before that, Freakonomics, which sold more than 4 million copies, is that a dispassionate, statistically minded thinker can find patterns and answers in the data that those who are emotionally invested in the material will have missed.
A shallow and therefore likely response to me is, aren't you doing the same? You're speaking about all of these things too. Obviously, there is no way to discuss the books without following their lead and engaging with their examples. The difference is that I actually listen to the real experts on each topic instead of dismissing them. I also do not overclaim. I've emphasized throughout that there is uncertainty in the conclusions and that the Freakonomics guys may have a point in some cases. In addition, my training allows me to engage at quite a high level with thinking like an economist, including behavioral tendencies plus the statistical approach economists use. Combining those two things is literally my area of research. So I can discuss issues of incentives or abortion and crime on the terms they themselves set, since I have basically the same background as them. And I know exactly what the pitfalls of that background are. So fuck you. To cement this, let's return to the very first example they use in Freakonomics to illustrate the importance of incentives, the Israeli Daycare Center, where a tardiness fee backfired, increasing the number of parents who picked up their children late. If you're an average Freakonomics enjoyer, you might be mad that I simply left it with a couple of snarky if books could kill comments instead of discussing their explanation. Now, you will be mad at how long I discussed their explanation for. Levitt and Dubner propose that there are actually three types of incentives: economic, social, and moral. We don't pick our noses not because of a financial cost, but because of social punishment, which can be considered a distinct type of cost. Similarly, we don't punch people in the nose because we and others feel that it is morally wrong, which makes us guilty, a further kind of cost. By Levitt and Dubner's reckoning, the daycare fine substituted an economic incentive for a moral incentive. So whereas the parents would previously feel guilty about being late, they now paid a fine and no longer incurred this moral cost, as they describe it. But there was another problem with the daycare center fine. It substituted an economic incentive, the $3 penalty, for a moral incentive, the guilt that parents were supposed to feel when they came late. For just a few dollars each day, parents could buy off their guilt. Initially, the moral incentive not to be late at the daycare center was amorphous, but clearly negative, which meant that not all parents were late. They felt this moral cost. When the vague feeling was replaced by a $3 fine, lateness went up. This indicated that parents felt at least $3 of guilt, so were willing to pay to assuage that feeling. Once the fine was removed, however, the lateness stayed up. This is kind of strange for the incentives framework because you would expect it to go back down now that parents were no longer able to buy off their guilt. But it didn't. They have an explanation for this too. Parents previously thought that lateness cost the nursery more than $3, say $10, and fewer felt justified in flouting this moral incentive. The intervention sent a signal, so most parents downgraded their previously higher estimate of the cost of lateness to the daycare center. Yet after the explicit fine was removed, the perceived reduction in guilt remained. Furthermore, the small size of the fine sent a signal to the parents that late pickups weren't such a big problem. If the daycare center suffers only $3 worth of pain for each late pickup, why bother to cut short your tennis game? Indeed, when the economists eliminated the $3 fine in the 17th week of their study, the number of late arriving parents didn't change. Now they could arrive late, pay no fine, and feel no guilt. Now, at first glance, this isn't great theorizing. They start by saying incentives work to solve everything, then tell a story where incentives didn't work as the lateness fine backfired. They then make up two new types of incentive to explain this and say moral incentives were displaced by the economic incentive. But now they can't explain why the lateness persisted once the fine was removed, so they introduce information uncertainty. Parents didn't know the moral incentive or got it wrong before the fine. Like, it could be right, but if your explanation changes every time new data appear, it's not a great one. Ask yourself the following questions. What does the Freakonomics theory of incentives predict that the simple one of economic incentives does not? Are social and moral incentives as readily identifiable as economic incentives before the fact? Once the outcome occurs, is there any pattern that can't be explained afterward? Would some scenarios require introducing political or environmental incentives? Why would these not be okay if social and moral ones are? How does adding the term incentive improve on just using the words moral and social? In short, they're claiming predictive power, but they don't have it. Recall how broad the Freakonomics definition of incentives was, how people get what they want or need when other people want or need the same thing.
Blaine, maybe I don't need a new friend. JC, Maybe you're the only friend I need. Blaine. Need or want. JC. I never been much for wanting. Blaine. Spoken like someone with needs.
Oh, jeez.
They basically seem to be defining every possible human behaviour as incentive-driven. As someone from my reading group put it,
How the Freakonomics authors demonstrate that everything is economics. Define economics to be the study of incentives. Call any reason why any person would ever do anything an incentive. Tell a bunch of anecdotes about people doing things.
wow, what a smart and interesting group of people. For only £5 a month, you can join us. In their reflections in Super Freakonomics, it becomes clear that their idea of incentives explains everything and nothing. The book did have a unifying theme, even if it wasn't obvious at the time, even to us. If pressed, you could boil it down to 4 words. People respond to incentives. If you wanted to get more expansive, you might say this: people respond to incentives, although not necessarily in ways that are predictable or manifest. Therefore, one of the most powerful laws in the universe is the law of unintended consequences. So, people respond to incentives, but we can't use that to predict their behaviour because of unintended consequences? This kind of reminds me of Yoram Borman's take on the idea of incentives.
Take a look at the next principle: people respond to incentives. Now, the dictionary says that incentive is a noun, that means motive. So when Mankiw says that people respond to incentives, what he's saying is that people are motivated by motives.
He's not just a climate economist, folks. He's the world's first stand-up economist with mixed success. It's one thing to call their theory loose and unfalsifiable. We could stop there. But I want to try to steelman their explanation. Can we think of moral incentives as equivalent to a kind of moral cost that can be traded off with economic incentives? In case you think they've abandoned that idea, Levitt insisted on it in a 2020 podcast.
The way I use the word incentives, I use it to cover everything. But I think it's not reductive ad absurdum because it's actually right. It's actually true that there are social incentives, and then there's also kind of moral incentives. And so given the kind of those 3 things, financial, moral, and social incentives, essentially cover more or less the universe of things that lead people who are paying attention to do the things they do. And
in The Skeptical Economist, Jonathan Aldred compares the Freakonomics notion of moral versus economic incentives to a guilt prevention pill. If you could pay for a pill to stop feeling guilty about something, you would do it as long as the guilt was more costly than the price of the pill, right? But a moment's inspection tells us that this would not work.
Even if such a pill existed, many people would not take it, knowing that if they did, they would simply feel guilty about the act of taking the pill instead. Because the pill does not alter the morality of the situation. Anyone capable of being deterred by guilt would not take the pill, while those willing to take it would not need to bother. They are willing to take a pill because their greed overwhelms their guilt.
So, if we wouldn't take a guilt prevention pill, why did it work in the Israeli daycare center? Why were the parents able to buy off their guilt in that case? You've probably heard people say something like, "Don't try to buy me off," in situations where money is not deemed appropriate, like soliciting sex, buying organs, or buying silence. But the daycare centre was simply not one of those cases, so no moral code was violated in the first place. The centre was already charging the parents money, so it still felt like they were paying for a service rather than being bought off. Philosopher Michael Sandel put it this way.
Parents considered a late pickup as a service for which they were willing to pay. They treated the fine as if it were a fee. What is the difference between a fine and a fee? It's worth pondering the distinction. Fines register moral disapproval, whereas fees are simply prices that imply no moral judgment. When we impose a fine for littering, we're saying that littering is wrong. Tossing a beer can into the Grand Canyon not only imposes cleanup costs, it reflects a bad attitude that we as a society want to discourage. Suppose the fine is $100, and a wealthy hiker decides it's worth the convenience of not having to carry his empties out of the park. He treats the fine as a fee and tosses his beer cans into the Grand Canyon. Even though he pays up, we consider that he's done something wrong. By treating the Grand Canyon as an expensive dumpster, he has failed to appreciate it in an appropriate way.
It seems that the parents saw the small fee as a license to be late, a kind of compensation to the daycare centre that justified their tardiness. Paying the fine every single day would have increased the total amount they paid by about 1/6 per month, which was deemed worth it for many parents. It just felt like extending the hourly pay rate an extra 10 minutes or so. Morality is a set of rules by which we aim to live our lives, and although we usually fall short, we can't easily be bought off. As Sandel points out, however, the gradual introduction of money into new areas of life can erode what moral responsibilities people have. Once it becomes normal for money to change hands, pushed by people with less strong moral views and those who have vested interests, then fines can become fees. In other words, there is no such thing as a moral incentive, as distinct from simple morality. The reason the penalty didn't work in the daycare centre is because it was subsumed into the parents' economic incentives, which are qualitatively different from moral considerations. Once moral considerations are introduced, we're in the world of the guilt avoidance pill, and most of us don't want to be bought off. The parents didn't feel like they were being bought off because they saw the fine as an extension of the fee they were already paying, an exchange of money for services rendered. The last resort of the Freakonomics guys is to speculate that a larger incentive, say $100, would have worked. I find this kind of true but also unconvincing. Firstly, because it's just speculation after the actual experiment they ran didn't work and they're supposed to be data-driven. Secondly, because I don't think it would work in the sense that the parents would hate it and just move elsewhere. Levitt and Dubner acknowledge that it would have engendered plenty of ill will, but they're really talking out of both sides of their mouth here. In their framework, if the charge is higher than the moral incentive, it should just work. Their suggestion inadvertently highlights another core issue. Whether such a scheme will work depends on considerations more complex and contextual than three types of incentives. As Aldred points out, the success of any incentive scheme necessarily hinges on the perceived motives and circumstances of the incentive makers and incentive takers.
Not only are guilt avoidance pills futile, but they can provoke resentment against those proffering them. A gift can trigger gratitude or resentment in the recipient, depending on how the recipient perceives the motives of the donor. Similarly, a fine can trigger resentment in parents if they feel manipulated, like puppets, rather than consulted as affected parties capable of understanding the daycare center's problem.
Had the reasons for the penalty been made clearer and widely believed, it may have had the desired effect, even at small levels. It's hard to fit this discussion of motives and transparency into the three incentive types. They could have used the Israeli daycare center as a launch pad to explore more interesting theories. This is, for example, the approach of Michael Sandel in the book What Money Can't Buy, which we quoted earlier. Another, well-known review of incentives uses a framework distinguishing between intrinsic motivations like morality and extrinsic motivations like money. It shows, using the Israeli daycare center example and others, that adding extrinsic motivators can cheapen intrinsic ones and therefore crowd them out, changing what was previously a moral and social task into a transaction. Intrinsic and extrinsic incentives is a much better taxonomy than economic, social, and moral. You can see this because it neatly explains why the lateness persisted after the fine was recalled. An area that was previously about intrinsic motivations not to be late had now been cheapened by money. So it was all about how much you were charged for not being late, which was now zero. The gradual encroachment of economic incentives depicted by Sandel had ruined the moral obligations there were previously, as he says.
Once the monetary payment had eroded the moral obligation to show up on time, the old sense of responsibility proved difficult to revive.
Maybe you'll accuse me of obsessively focusing on this example, and guilty. I'm a behavioural economist, so it definitely got to me. They also have this entire section on behavioural economics in Super Freakonomics that, as a behavioural economist, made me tear out my remaining hair. Maybe I'll make a Patreon-only video about that. Why go to such lengths about this example that they've probably forgotten? My point here is that for all their imperiosity and arrogance about everything, all of their incentives explain behaviour, they can't even explain their first example in their first book. It's something to act like your way of thinking can shed new light on problems outside your domain of expertise. It's quite another when you fail to make sufficient progress in your own field. I know physicists can be annoying and imperialistic too, but at least they've made major discoveries and continue to do so. Economist Diane Coyle, quoting a review in the Metro newspaper, said the following:
This review in Metro caught my eye because what it says about Super Freakonomics was the reason I didn't like the massively best-selling Freakonomics, pitched at the type of young, brash go-getter who would rather say something provocative on a subject than something serious. This book is a depressingly empty exercise in pop sociology. I found Freakonomics gimmicky when economics is a pretty serious subject.
Don't try and explain everything when you can't even explain the economy. Freakonomics is not even about economics. Of course, the authors always knew this, and that was part of its appeal. But it's instructive that the book was published in 2005, and the global financial crisis began just 2 years later. In my opinion, neither the economy itself nor the field of economics have truly recovered from this crisis, and Freakonomics contains not so much as a whiff of what was going on in the financial sector at the time. They even claimed house prices were too low because estate agents were underpricing. They transparently missed the formative economic event of my generation. I might have been able to tolerate cutesy economics books if there hadn't been about 7 more formative economic events in my life since then. This should force us to ask more fundamental questions than what sumo wrestlers and school teachers have in common. Let me ask one such question in a Freakonomics manner. What do landowners, employers, and white people have in common? You can tell a lot about someone's worldview from who they assign agency in their arguments. Who is front and centre? You may think I'm going to say that racists give white people more agency, sexists give men more agency, and so on. But it's actually more like the opposite. Whomever has agency has responsibility, and those who are considered the default are given more leeway. Boys will be boys. Employers will associate black names with negative characteristics. Landowners will aggressively develop their land to avoid environmental regulation. Freakonomics fails to ask why these actions are taking place, the historical, social, and legal frameworks that give rise to them. It doesn't assign responsibility to certain groups. Let me ask another question in a super Freakonomics manner. What are the unintended consequences of capitalism, contract law, and property rights? For Levitt and Dubner, thinking like an economist means not thinking about the economic system. It's not even that they praise capitalism, it's that they don't see it. I'd prefer if they praised capitalism because at least they'd be talking about it. How do you consider yourself a rogue economist who thinks outside the box when the economic system we're in, which is only a few hundred years old, is taken as a given? This is why the idea that economics just explains reality is dead on arrival. Reality can change, and noticing the huge changes over the past few hundred years should be one of the central questions of economics. Okay, so this is now an excellent BreadTube video. I've claimed the Freakonomics duo are racist and neoliberal, and it's all capitalism's fault. Please invite me to Nebula. At the start of this video, I offered 3 narratives we could plausibly attach to Freakonomics. One is that they are simply highly successful via their bestseller, Levitt's solid academic career, and continued high viewership. Another is that they initially did well, but their relevance faded as their findings have been debunked, and Levitt dropped out of academia early with a disappointing career. The third was a bit of a rogue one. They are awkward contrarian nerds who happened across fame and fortune with their quirky approach to everything. You could call these 3 narratives the good, the bad, and the ugly. As I said, they're all kind of true, but I actually think the third one, which is favoured by the authors, is both true and the most subtly dangerous. Because they think of themselves as smart guys surrounded by other smart guys who are kind of above it all. This makes them prone to being catastrophically wrong about the most important issues in the world. If there's one lesson of our era, it's that nerds are often the bad guys because they are bitter and insulated and lack social intelligence. Yet through writing scores of high school movies, they've managed to convince us that jocks are the bad guys and that they're the victims. Just because attractive guys with social skills who were good at sports were popular at school doesn't mean they were victimizing you. You may have been a prick as well. Basically, I'm less of a fan of this version of this cartoon and more of a fan of this version. I don't have anything against nerds. I am, after all, one of you. But sometimes I think we need to look inward and work on our own culture instead of blaming others. Does the fact that these 2 nerds are named Stephen and Stephen represent a mere curiosity? Or does it say something deeper about culture? Freakonomics is a time capsule. From a time when smart thinking meant taking a loose insight like people respond to incentives or trends suddenly catch on and dogmatically applying it to a number of situations where it may or may not work, yielding insights that amount to amateur sociology at best, all while insisting you're doing something new and clever, where smart thinking meant never interrogating your own personal or professional biases, acting like you're above it all when you're basically just a gullible last person I spoke to type who still falls back on ideas you picked up from popular media when you were 12. In their book From Economics Imperialism to Freakonomics, Fine and Milanakos chastised the latter.
Far from questioning its own economic principles, it extends them, inconsistently modified and applied if necessary, in appropriating a widening range of subject matter. Freakonomics presents itself as technical and neutral, with its originator something of a geek, interested in the peculiar workings of the world, much like the hacker in software and viruses. But the freak is not neutral, for whilst the attachment to contemporary economics appears limited, apart from the obsession with incentives, there is no reference at all to issues of structure, power, and conflict.
Super Freakonomics is simply what happens when, from this questionable starting point, you get high on your own supply. As for the rest of their work, some of their podcasts are worth listening to, like this one on worker democracy and this one with Roland Fryer, who comes across pretty well, to be honest. The podcasts are certainly well made. I find their blogging, their thinking like a freak, less interesting. The modern edition of Freakonomics shares a number of their columns from the time, presumably the best ones. Yet as I went through them, I just lost interest and stopped reading. The same applies to their two subsequent books, Think Like a Freak and How to Rob a Bank. I don't care about the topics and I don't trust the authors. The former is better written than the latter, but we've got actual economic problems to solve these days. Their insights into the actual economy just seem to be government doesn't work and charge for healthcare, which just aren't right. But which authors should you trust? Maybe someone who is literally right in front of your eyes as you are watching this video, who is saying to you the words, "I have written a book about economics, please read it." That's right. Why We're Getting Poorer is coming out soon. Actually, it's out right now. This whole video has been an advert for my own book. Move over, Philosophy Tube. I can push my shit on my channel too. Seriously, I'm happy with this book. It's basically an economics explainer with a polemic theme about how the economy is screwing the average person over, or at the very least, how it seems to feel that way across the world for so many. I discuss issues from the rise of billionaires and their companies, to the money system, to the supply chain and cost of living crises over the past few years. And there are plenty of Simpsons references.
Alright, you listen up, you little freaks!
Let's do a completely fair and unbiased comparison of my book and Freakonomics. So my book is actually about economics, defers to experts where relevant, including non-economists, attempts to broaden my perspective by including a wide range of countries and scholars, doesn't try to apply one simple framework to explain everything, doesn't overemphasize the counterintuitive nature of things or die on controversial hills for the sake of it, avoids gawking at people who aren't white male nerds, will cure cancer. Having said that, I learned a lot about public communication from Freakonomics, and I can only hope my book is half as readable as theirs. Please help, as I've got to overtake Gary Stevenson. I don't want to do this too much, so you have my word. I will not mention my book in this way on this channel again, unless I have a really good reason to. Like sales are declining or I change my mind about everything I just said. Our modern, crisis-filled age should be the death of cutesy pop economics books. After all, we need to spend our time on the works that really help us through this moment. Without reservation, Willow raises her arms, and I slowly raise her sweater up and over her head and arms, then toss it violently to the floor. "Why are you wearing this red lace bra?" I ask gruffly. "Did you know we'd end up here?" I tease as I send the bra sailing to the floor as well. I blow lightly on one of her nipples and can feel my cake as I watch it shrink into the shape of a raisin. Was that your strategy all along? No. Keep your arms up and don't move them. I'm going to pull your jeans and panties down to your ankles and have a taste now. She bites the corner of her lip in what I think is anticipation, so it feels like I'm on the right track. Like a toy on Christmas morning, I unwrap my gorgeous tutor one layer at a time until she's completely bare for me, and just like a favourite toy, the one you've been waiting to unwrap all morning. I want to play with it all fucking night. You are very tricky, Teach. You act like you don't give a shit about me, but you're soaking wet. I think you've wanted me from the moment we met. I only have to gently tap her with the tip of the tongue to watch her ass flutter. She's not cold anymore. In fact, she's practically sweating from the heat rising between us. You like that, Teach? Yes. You want more? Yes, she growls. I lift my hoodie off with a feeling of smug satisfaction and lay down on the bed with my head on the pillow. Spread your legs and come sit on top of my face. What? Ride my face, Willow, so when you hard, I can watch you as I swallow your release at the same time. Oh my god. I don't just have my nickname because of what I can do on the field, baby. I'm a freak in many ways, and you're about to find out tonight just how freaky I can get. Wait, she places a hand on my forearm. I have to tell you something. Okay, I say tentatively, hoping she's not checking out on me. I don't know how to ride your face. I'm smiling at her, holding back a laugh until my stiff dick understands the sincerity with which she said those words. Holy shit. She's not joking around. Willow, are you a virgin?